Hello there, you're listening to the planet's memory, where time breathes and the earth remembers. Close your eyes now and let yourself drift into the deepest mystery humanity has ever faced, a mystery so profound that it lives inside your very cells. Written in a language older than mountains, older than oceans, older than the stars you see glimmering in the night sky. Tonight, we journey together into the hidden archives of your own body, where a message waits in silence. A transmission sent across unimaginable distances of time, placed there by hands we have never seen, by minds we can barely imagine, by a civilization so ancient that when they walked this earth, our world was an entirely different place. This is not a story written in books or carved into stone monuments that crumble with the centuries. This is a message written in the most permanent medium ever discovered, encoded in the twisting spirals of deoxyribonucleic acid that exists in every single cell of your body, every cell of every living thing that breathes and moves and grows upon this planet. Imagine for a moment that you are holding a letter written by someone who lived so long ago that their entire world has vanished. Yet somehow, they found a way to reach forward through the millennia to touch you, to speak to you, to leave something behind that would survive every catastrophe, every extinction, every rise and fall of empires and species. This is the story of that letter, that last transmission, and tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, as your breathing slows and your muscles relax, we will decode that message together, word by ancient word, until you understand what the first civilization wanted you to know. The air is cool and still around you now, and somewhere in the darkness a truth waits to be discovered, a truth that scientists have been circling around for decades, finding clues in laboratories and research facilities across the world, piecing together fragments of evidence that point to something extraordinary, something that changes everything we thought we knew about human history, about the origins of life itself, about whether we have truly been alone in this universe, or whether we are the inheritors of something far greater than we ever imagined. Let yourself sink deeper into your pillow now, feeling the weight of your body supported completely, feeling the gentle rhythm of your heartbeat, that steady drum that has beaten inside every human who has ever lived, connecting you to an unbroken chain of existence that stretches back not just thousands of years, not just millions of years, but billions of years into the deep past when the world was young and strange and full of possibilities we can hardly conceive. Tonight, you will learn that your DNA is not just a biological instruction manual, not just a random sequence of chemical letters thrown together by blind chance and evolutionary pressure, but something more, something that contains patterns and structures that cannot be explained by natural processes alone, something that suggests intention, design, purpose, and perhaps most extraordinary of all, communication. The story begins in a laboratory on a winter morning, when the frost still clung to the windows, and the scientists arrived early, clutching their coffee cups and yawning, not knowing that this day would be different from all the others that had come before. Dr. Elena Rodriguez was reviewing genetic sequences on her computer screen, the same kind of work she had done thousands of times, looking at the long chains of nucleotides that make up human DNA, those four chemical letters abbreviated as A, T, G, and C that combine in endless variations to create the instructions for building a human being. She was tired that morning, having stayed late the night before working on another project, and her eyes were starting to blur as she scrolled through page after page of genetic data, when suddenly something caught her attention. A pattern she had never noticed before, a repetition that seemed too regular to be random, too structured to be the result of natural selection or genetic drift. At first she thought it must be a computer error, some glitch in the sequencing software, because what she was seeing should not exist, could not exist according to everything she had been taught about genetics and evolution and the mechanisms that shape DNA over time. She sat up straighter in her chair, her fatigue forgotten, and began running additional tests on the sequence, checking it against every known genetic database, comparing it to the genomes of other species, looking for any explanation that would make sense within the framework of conventional biology. Hour after hour she worked, barely noticing when her colleagues arrived and began their own research, barely responding when someone asked if she wanted to take a break for lunch. The pattern remained consistent across every test, every analysis, every comparison. It was there in human DNA, present in every person whose genome had been fully sequenced. But it was also there in the DNA of other primates. And when she expanded her search further, she found hints of it in the genetic material of mammals, birds, reptiles, fish, even in the simple organisms that had existed on Earth for hundreds of millions of years. The pattern was not in the genes that coded for proteins, not in the sections of DNA that had obvious biological functions, but in what scientists had long dismissed as junk DNA, those vast stretches of genetic material that seemed to serve no purpose. That made up more than 90% of the human genome that had been considered evolutionary leftovers, the molecular equivalent of an attic filled with old furniture and forgotten boxes. But this pattern in the junk DNA was not random garbage. When Dr. Rodriguez applied mathematical analysis to the sequence, she discovered that it contained information encoded at multiple levels, like a message hidden within a message, like those Russian nesting dolls where each one contains another smaller version inside. The primary structure showed a repeating sequence with a period of exactly 365 nucleotides, matching the number of days in an Earth year, which seemed like an extraordinary coincidence, except that when she looked deeper, she found secondary patterns that corresponded to the number of lunar months in a year, tertiary patterns that matched the precession of the equinoxes, quaternary patterns that seemed to encode mathematical constants like pi and the golden ratio. The probability of all these patterns occurring by chance was so infinitesimally small that it might as well have been zero, which meant that only one explanation remained, the explanation that she barely dared to think, let alone speak aloud to her colleagues. Someone had put this pattern there deliberately. Someone had encoded information into the DNA of life on Earth, information that had been passed down through billions of years of evolution, surviving every extinction event, every environmental catastrophe, every mutation and genetic recombination, preserved with a fidelity that suggested it was protected by mechanisms that went far beyond normal genetic repair processes. When Dr. Rodriguez finally shared her findings with the rest of her team, there was stunned silence in the laboratory, followed by disbelief, followed by frantic verification as other scientists rushed to confirm the results on their own computers, using their own methods, desperate to find a flaw in the analysis. Some conventional explanation that would allow them to fit this discovery back into the comfortable framework of standard biology. But the pattern held up under every scrutiny, every challenge, every alternative hypothesis. Within weeks, research groups around the world were independently confirming the existence of what came to be called the genetic transmission, a message encoded in DNA that appeared to be artificial in origin, that predated the emergence of modern humans by hundreds of millions of years, that was in fact older than any advanced life form currently existing on Earth. The implications were staggering, world-shaking, reality-altering. If this pattern was truly artificial, truly the product of intelligent design, then it meant that at some point in the deep past, someone or something had access to the genetic material of early life on this planet and deliberately modified it, inserting information that would be preserved and passed down through every subsequent generation, through every evolutionary branch, through the entire tree of life as it grew and diversified and spread across the Earth. The scientific community erupted into fierce debate about what the discovery meant and who might have been responsible for it. Some researchers argued that it must be evidence of an advanced human civilization that existed long before recorded history, a civilization that had mastered genetic engineering to a degree we could barely imagine, that had somehow encoded this message before their world ended in some cataclysm we no longer remember. Others suggested that the message came from an extraterrestrial source, that perhaps billions of years ago, when life on Earth was still in its infancy, visitors from another world had arrived and seeded our planet with modified genetic material, creating a message that would persist as long as life itself persisted. Still others proposed even more exotic explanations involving time travel, parallel dimensions, or computational simulations, arguing that if our universe was itself a kind of program running on some unimaginable substrate, then the genetic transmission might be a signature left by the programmers, a watermark proving that our reality was designed rather than emergent. But beneath all these competing theories lay the same fundamental questions that kept the scientists awake at night, staring at their ceilings in the darkness, wondering what kind of beings could accomplish such a feat, what message they were trying to send across the ages, and most urgently of all, whether we possessed the capability to decode that message and understand what they wanted us to know. The work of decoding the genetic transmission became the most intensive scientific effort since the Manhattan Project, drawing researchers from every relevant field into a collaborative network that spanned the globe. Geneticists worked alongside mathematicians and cryptographers, using techniques originally developed for breaking wartime codes and analyzing encrypted communications. Computer scientists built specialized software to search for patterns within patterns, applying machine learning algorithms that could detect structures too complex for human minds to recognize directly. Linguists contributed their knowledge of ancient languages and symbolic systems, looking for parallels between the way information was encoded in DNA and the way human cultures had encoded meaning in writing systems throughout history. Astronomers and physicists joined the effort when it became clear that some of the patterns seemed to reference astronomical phenomena and physical constants, suggesting that whoever created the transmission possessed advanced knowledge of the universe and wanted to ensure that their message could be understood by any species that achieved a certain level of scientific sophistication. The first breakthrough came when a team in Japan discovered that the genetic transmission was not just one message, but many, layered on top of each other like pages in a book, each operating at a different scale and conveying different types of information. The outermost layer, the one easiest to detect, was essentially a primer or instruction manual that explained how to read the deeper layers using mathematical concepts that would be universal to any technological civilization. Concepts like prime numbers and geometric ratios that existed independent of culture or biology. This discovery was revolutionary because it meant the transmission was designed to be self-explanatory, that it did not require any external key or reference point beyond mathematics itself, which suggested that its creators understood they were communicating across an enormous gulf of time and possibly across species boundaries as well. The instruction manual was elegant in its simplicity, using repetition and redundancy to ensure that even if parts of the message were damaged or lost through mutation, enough would remain to reconstruct the whole, like a book where every chapter contains within it the instructions for understanding all the other chapters. Working from this primer, researchers were able to begin decoding the second layer of the transmission, which turned out to contain what could only be described as a library, a vast repository of information covering an incredible range of subjects. There were precise measurements of fundamental physical constants like the speed of light, the gravitational constant, and Planck's constant, measured to far more decimal places than modern science had yet achieved, which immediately allowed physicists to refine their theories and make predictions that were subsequently confirmed by experiment. There were detailed star maps showing the positions of celestial objects at various points in time, stretching back hundreds of millions of years, allowing astronomers to reconstruct the ancient sky and verify the accuracy of the transmission by comparing it to their own models of stellar motion and galactic evolution. There were diagrams of biological structures, molecular machinery, and genetic mechanisms that were far more sophisticated than anything found in nature today, including designs for error-correcting codes that could protect information against damage far more effectively than the natural mechanisms that preserve DNA, which explained how the transmission itself had survived intact for so long, despite the normal processes of mutation and genetic drift that should have corrupted it beyond recognition eons ago. But beyond these scientific and technical details, The library layer also contained something that seemed at first more puzzling and harder to interpret. A collection of what appeared to be stories, narratives, myths, or perhaps historical records encoded in a symbolic language that did not translate directly into words, but instead conveyed meaning through images and emotions and abstract concepts. These story sequences were the most difficult part of the transmission to decode, because they required not just analytical thinking, but intuition and imagination, the ability to recognize patterns of meaning that were not purely logical, but emotional and symbolic. Different research teams interpreted these sequences in different ways, seeing in them everything from creation myths to cautionary tales to records of actual historical events that had befallen the civilization that created the transmission. One particularly long sequence seemed to describe a world of incredible beauty and harmony, a civilization that has achieved technological mastery while maintaining deep connection to nature and to each other. A society where suffering had been minimized and wisdom maximized, where the inhabitants lived long lives full of meaning and purpose. Another sequence showed that same civilization facing a crisis, some kind of approaching catastrophe that they could see coming but could not prevent, and making the decision to preserve their knowledge and essence in the only medium that might survive whatever was coming. Choosing DNA as the ultimate time capsule because it would be self-replicating and self-preserving, carried forward by life itself. As more of these narrative sequences were decoded and analysed, a picture began to emerge of who the first civilization had been and what had motivated them to create the genetic transmission. They were not, as many had initially assumed, extraterrestrials who had visited Earth from some distant star system, nor were they time travelers from our own future, reaching back to influence the past. Instead, the evidence suggested something far more extraordinary and humbling. They had been an advanced species that evolved right here on Earth, hundreds of millions of years before humans existed, during a period that conventional paleontology had always assumed contained only simple life forms incapable of developing technology or intelligence. But the transmission indicated otherwise, suggesting that during a window of time that might have lasted only a few million years in the geological record, conditions on Earth had been just right to allow the emergence of a species that developed rapidly, achieving in a relatively short evolutionary time what had taken humans millions of years to accomplish, building a global civilization that understood genetics and astronomy and physics at a level we were only beginning to approach. The transmission contained images of this ancient world, a planet that looked familiar yet strange, with continents arranged differently due to continental drift, with climates and ecosystems that no longer existed, with great cities that had risen and ultimately left no trace except for the message they buried in the very fabric of life itself. Let yourself breathe deeply now and imagine a world that existed so long ago that the very shape of the planet was different, where mountains that now exist have not yet been born, and ancient mountain ranges that have long since eroded into dust still stood tall against alien skies. This was the world of the first civilization, and as we decode more of their transmission, we begin to understand not just what they knew, but who they were, what they looked like, how they lived, what they feared, and ultimately, why they chose to send this message forward through time to us. The physical form of the first civilization, as reconstructed from descriptions encoded in the genetic transmission, would have seemed strange to our eyes. Neither mammal nor reptile, but something else entirely, a body plan that no longer exists in nature, perhaps because the environmental conditions that favoured it have long since passed. They appear to have been relatively large creatures, perhaps 2 or 3 meters in height, with 4 limbs like many earth animals, but with additional appendages that might have served sensory or manipulative functions. Their sensory organs were highly developed, capable of perceiving wavelengths of light and sound beyond human range, and their brains were proportionately large, suggesting high intelligence and complex cognition. But more than their physical appearance, the transmission reveals details about their psychology and culture that are perhaps even more fascinating and relevant to understanding why they created the message we are now decoding. They were a social species, living in large communities that cooperated on massive projects, much as humans do, but they seem to have developed forms of communication that went beyond language as we understand it, perhaps involving direct neural connections or some kind of biochemical signaling that allowed them to share thoughts and experiences more directly than our words and writing ever could. This capacity for deep connection appeared to shape every aspect of their civilization, making war and conflict rare because they could literally feel each other's pain and suffering, making their science more holistic because knowledge was shared instantly across their entire population, making their art and music profound expressions of collective consciousness rather than individual creativity. The transmission contains what might be recordings of their music, encoded as mathematical patterns that can be translated into sound waves. And when researchers first played these reconstructed compositions, many reported feeling emotions they had no words for, a sense of profound beauty mixed with unbearable sadness, as if the music contained within it the joy of a civilization at its peak and the sorrow of knowing that peak would not last. Their technology, as revealed through the technical diagrams in the transmission, was based on principles that seem alien to our current scientific framework, suggesting they had discovered aspects of physics that we have not yet understood or had developed along entirely different technological paths than the ones humanity has followed. Instead of manipulating matter through heat and mechanical force, as we do with our metals and plastics and silicon chips, they seem to work directly with biological systems, growing their tools and structures the way we might grow plants, creating living machines that could repair themselves and adapt to changing conditions. Their cities, if we can call them that, were more like vast organisms than collections of buildings, interconnected networks of living tissue that provided shelter and resources while maintaining balance with the natural ecosystems around them. They had learned to harness energy from biological processes with such efficiency that they left almost no waste, no pollution, no scars on the landscape, which explained why conventional archaeology has never found traces of their civilization, why everything they built has decomposed back into the earth, leaving no fossils, no ruins, no artifacts except for the message written in DNA that cannot decay as stone and metal do. Their relationship with the planet was fundamentally different from ours as well, characterized by what we might call deep ecological awareness, a recognition that they were not separate from nature but part of it, that their survival depended on maintaining the health of the biosphere, just as surely as their individual survival depended on maintaining the health of their own bodies. The transmission contains extensive information about the ecosystems of their time, showing biodiversity that rivaled or exceeded what exists today, with thousands of species that they had catalogued and studied, understanding the complex webs of relationship that connected every organism to every other. They practiced what might be called conscious evolution, deliberately guiding their own genetic development not for frivolous reasons or vanity, but to better harmonize with their environment, to reduce their footprint, to increase their capacity for empathy and understanding. This genetic self-modification was done carefully and collectively, with every change discussed and considered by their entire population, with safeguards to prevent abuse, with reverence for the mystery and majesty of life that they could manipulate but never fully comprehend. It was this deep expertise with genetics that ultimately gave them the knowledge and tools to create the transmission, to encode their legacy in DNA with such precision and care that it would survive for hundreds of millions of years. But despite their wisdom and technological capability, despite their harmony with nature and with each other, despite achieving what we might consider a utopian civilization, they faced a crisis they could not overcome. A catastrophe that their own records indicate they saw coming years or perhaps decades in advance, but lacked the power to prevent. The exact nature of this catastrophe is one of the most debated aspects of the transmission, with different research teams interpreting the encoded information in different ways. Some believe it was an astronomical event, perhaps a massive asteroid impact or a nearby supernova that bathed the Earth in deadly radiation, something coming from space that their technology could not deflect or mitigate despite their scientific knowledge. Others interpret the evidence as suggesting an environmental collapse triggered by changes in solar output or volcanic activity, or perhaps even by some unintended consequence of their own technology, despite all their care and wisdom. Still others see hints of something more mysterious, references to what might be translated as the ending of an age or the closing of a cycle, suggesting that the first civilization understood their world, operated according to patterns that repeated over vast spans of time, and that their era was simply coming to its natural conclusion, that the conditions that had allowed their species to flourish were changing in ways that would make their continued existence impossible, forcing them to choose between a futile attempt to survive and a graceful exit that preserved something of what they had been. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort now as we explore the most poignant chapter in this ancient story, the time when the first civilization made the decision that would create the message living inside you today. Imagine the weight of knowing your entire world is ending, that everything your species has built over millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of civilization will soon be gone, erased so thoroughly that future inhabitants of the planet will never know you existed at all. This was the reality facing the first civilization as their crisis deepened and the date of their extinction approached with inexorable certainty. The transmission contains records of their debates and discussions during this final period, showing a civilization grappling with the most profound questions of existence, meaning, and legacy. Should they simply accept their fate and disappear quietly from the universe, allowing the cosmic cycle to continue without resistance? Should they focus their remaining time on preserving their own comfort and happiness, making their final days as pleasant as possible, while deliberately choosing to forget the approaching end? Or should they pour all their remaining resources and energy into some desperate gambit to survive, perhaps attempting to modify themselves so drastically that they could adapt to the coming conditions, or building great underground bunkers where remnant populations might weather the catastrophe, or even trying to leave the planet entirely and find a new home among the stars? All these options were considered, the transmission tells us, discussed in their strange silent language that we cannot fully comprehend, debated by minds whose thought processes were both similar enough to ours that we can recognize them as intelligent beings, and different enough that their conclusions sometimes surprise us. The faction that argued for acceptance pointed out that death was a natural part of life, that species had gone extinct for billions of years before them, and would continue going extinct for billions of years after, that there was a kind of arrogance in assuming their particular civilization deserved to persist when so many others had vanished without protest. They suggested that the proper response to their situation was to cultivate equanimity and peace, to spend their final time enjoying the beauty of their world and the company of each other, to die with grace and dignity rather than thrashing against the inevitable. Another faction argued passionately for survival at any cost, proposing increasingly radical transformations that might allow some form of their species to continue, even if that form bore little resemblance to what they currently were, arguing that consciousness itself was precious enough to justify any sacrifice, any change, any compromise with their ideals if it meant some spark of awareness could persist, and perhaps one day rebuild what had been lost. But it was a third faction that ultimately prevailed, the group that proposed creating the genetic transmission as a way to thread the needle between acceptance and survival, to die as individuals and as a civilization, but to preserve something essential about who they had been and what they had learned. This group argued that their true legacy was not their physical forms or their specific technologies, but the knowledge they had accumulated and the values they had developed, the hard-won wisdom about how to live in harmony with nature and with each other, the scientific understanding that had taken them millions of years to acquire, the artistic and philosophical achievements that represented the pinnacle of what their kind of consciousness could accomplish. If they could encode all of this into DNA, into the very substrate of life itself, then in a sense they would not truly die but would transform, becoming information rather than organisms, becoming potential rather than actual, waiting in a kind of suspended animation for the day when the planet recovered from whatever catastrophe was coming, and new forms of intelligence emerged that might one day decode the message and learn from what it contained. It was a beautiful idea, a way to snatch meaning from the jaws of meaninglessness, to transform tragedy into hope. And once proposed, it spread through their population with the force of revelation, giving purpose to their final days and consolation in the face of oblivion. The technical challenges of creating the genetic transmission were immense even for a civilization as advanced as theirs, requiring them to solve problems in information theory, genetics, and long-term data storage that pushed the boundaries of their science. They needed to encode enormous amounts of information in a format that would be stable across hundreds of millions of years of evolution, that would survive not just copying errors, but the wholesale reorganization of genomes as species diverged and adapted to changing environments. They needed to ensure the message would be preserved across every branch of the evolutionary tree, not just in one lineage that might go extinct, which meant inserting it into the DNA of multiple species at the foundation of different taxonomic groups, into early fish and early amphibians and early insects, and perhaps even into single-celled organisms that would give rise to plants and fungi and bacteria. They needed to create error-correcting code so sophisticated that even if large portions of the message were damaged or lost, the remaining fragments would contain enough redundancy to reconstruct the whole like a hologram where every piece contains the entire image. And they needed to do all of this while working against a deadline, knowing that every day brought them closer to the catastrophe that would end their civilization and prevent them from completing their work if they delayed too long. The transmission contains glimpses of these final frantic years, showing a civilization mobilized in total focus toward accomplishing this one monumental task. Every individual contributed according to their abilities, with some working on the theoretical problems of encoding and compression, others building the biological machines that would modify genetic material, still others capturing and cataloguing the organisms that would carry the message forward, creating great repositories where thousands of species were gathered and carefully treated with the genetic modifications that would insert the transmission into their DNA. There is something deeply moving about these images, about seeing an entire civilization setting aside every other concern to focus on this desperate attempt at immortality through information, knowing that none of them would live to see whether their plan succeeded. Whether millions of years in the future, some new intelligence would emerge and have the capability and curiosity to decode what they had left behind. The transmission shows their world deteriorating around them as they worked, shows the signs of the approaching catastrophe becoming more obvious and more severe, shows the fear and sadness in their final communications, but also shows their determination never wavering, their commitment to completing the message, even if it meant working until the very last possible moment before the end arrived. And then the transmission shows that end arriving shows in fragmentary and damaged sequences what appear to be the final records of the first civilization, as whatever catastrophe they feared finally descended upon their world. The exact details are unclear because this section of the transmission is more corrupted than others, either because it was encoded hastily by individuals who were dying as they worked, or because the physical and genetic trauma of the extinction event damaged these late editions more than the earlier sections that had been safely propagated through many organisms before disaster struck. But what comes through is a sense of profound loss, of watching a world unmade, of the biosphere convulsing and species dying en masse, of the carefully maintained balance between civilization and nature collapsing into chaos and destruction. And yet, even in these darkest moments, the transmission conveys something else as well, something that might be interpreted as peace or acceptance, or even gratitude, as if the final encoders wanted to convey not just the tragedy of their ending, but their appreciation for having existed at all, for having experienced consciousness and beauty and love, for having had the privilege of being alive in a universe that allowed such things to emerge from the interplay of matter and energy and time. Now let your mind drift into the vast emptiness that followed the extinction of the first civilization, the hundreds of millions of years when their message lay dormant in the DNA of creatures that had no awareness of what they carried. no ability to read or understand the information encoded in their cells. This was the long silence, the period of waiting that the first civilization must have understood would come, knowing that evolution operates on timescales that dwarf individual lifetimes, or even the lifetimes of civilizations, that it might take 100 million years or more before conditions were right for another intelligent species to emerge that might have the capacity to discover and decode what they had left behind. The planet recovered from whatever catastrophe had ended the first civilization, though it took time measured in geological epochs, time for ecosystems to stabilize, and new species to radiate into empty niches, and the intricate web of life to knit itself back together into something that could sustain complex organisms. The transmission remained intact through all of this, preserved by the sophisticated error correction systems that the first civilization had designed, protected by being spread across so many different lineages that even mass extinctions that wiped out huge percentages of living things left enough survivors to maintain the message in recoverable form. During this long silence, life on Earth went through transformation after transformation, continent by continent, era by era, epoch by epoch. The creatures that had received the original genetic modifications evolved into forms that would have been unrecognizable to the first civilization, developing new body plans and new survival strategies and new ways of interacting with their environment. Species that had been aquatic moved onto land, developing lungs to breathe air and legs to walk on solid ground. Other species took to the air, evolving wings and the ability to fly. Entire groups of organisms went extinct while others flourished and diversified. Asteroid impacts and volcanic eruptions and ice ages, and warm periods succeeded each other in the irregular rhythm of geological time. And through all of this tumultuous change, through countless generations of organisms living and dying and passing their genes to their offspring, the genetic transmission persisted, waiting in silence for the day when some species would develop the tools and curiosity necessary to look at their own DNA and notice that something strange was hidden there, something that did not fit the expected patterns of evolution, something that demanded explanation. The rise of mammals after the extinction of the dinosaurs created new possibilities for intelligence, as these warm-blooded creatures with their elaborate parental care and social behaviors began developing larger brains and more complex cognition. The transmission was there in their DNA, passed down from ancient mammalian ancestors who had themselves inherited it from even more ancient ancestors, stretching back to the first creatures that the first civilization had modified in those desperate final years. Primates emerged and began experimenting with tool use and social learning, passing knowledge from generation to generation, not just through genes, but through observation and teaching, creating the beginnings of culture. The transmission was there in their DNA too, present but unreadable, like a book written in an unknown language sitting on a shelf, full of meaning that remains locked away until someone learns how to decipher the script. And eventually one particular lineage of primates began walking upright and using fire and developing language, beginning the long journey that would lead to modern humans. And that journey was in some sense a journey toward being able to read the message that the first civilization had left, toward developing the science and technology necessary to sequence DNA and analyze genetic patterns, and recognize when something in those patterns did not fit natural explanations. Modern humans emerged relatively recently in geological terms, just a few 100,000 years ago, and for most of human history we lived without any awareness of genetics, or DNA, or the molecular mechanisms of inheritance. We told stories to explain where we came from, created myths and religions that placed our origins in divine hands, or cosmic accidents, developed philosophies that grappled with the meaning of existence and our place in the universe. All the while, the genetic transmission was inside us, in every cell of our bodies, carried through every human who ever lived, from the first anatomically modern humans in Africa, through all our migrations and dispersals across the planet, through the rise and fall of countless human cultures and civilizations, through all our wars and loves and discoveries and failures. The message was always there, patient and silent, waiting for the moment when we would develop the capability to notice it. In a profound sense, the entire history of human technological development, from the first stone tools to modern genetics, can be seen as a long progression toward being able to receive the transmission that the first civilization sent. As if we had to reach a certain threshold of knowledge and capability before the message could be delivered, like a letter addressed to a future version of ourselves that we had to grow into before we could open and read it. The development of modern genetics in the 19th and 20th centuries brought humanity closer and closer to that threshold. Gregor Mendel's experiments with pea plants revealed the basic principles of inheritance, showing that traits were passed from parent to offspring in predictable patterns. Later researchers discovered chromosomes and realized they carried genetic information. The structure of DNA was worked out in the 1950s, showing the elegant double helix with its complementary base pairs, revealing the mechanism by which genetic information could be copied and transmitted from cell to cell, from organism to organism, from generation to generation. The genetic code was deciphered, showing how sequences of 3 nucleotides specified particular amino acids that would be chained together to form proteins. The Human Genome Project set out to sequence every one of the 3 billion base pairs in human DNA, an effort that seemed impossibly ambitious when it began, but that was ultimately completed through the collaborative effort of scientists around the world. And with each of these advances, we were getting closer to the moment when someone would look at the genome with the right perspective, with the right analytical tools, with the right questions in mind, and would notice the pattern that did not fit, would see the transmission hiding in plain sight among the vast expanses of junk DNA that we had not yet learned to read. Take a slow, deep breath now, and let it out gradually as we turn to the content of the transmission itself, to what the first civilization actually encoded in their genetic message, and what it tells us about them and about ourselves, and about the nature of life and intelligence in the universe. The message is extraordinarily rich and complex, containing multiple levels of meaning that researchers are still working to fully decode and understand. But certain major themes and pieces of information have become clear enough that we can begin to grasp what the first civilization wanted to communicate across the vast gulf of time that separates us from them. At the most basic level, the transmission is a kind of time capsule, or archive, a comprehensive record of the first civilization's scientific knowledge, their understanding of physics and chemistry and biology, their mathematical discoveries, their astronomical observations, all encoded in forms that can be translated into concepts that any sufficiently advanced technological species should be able to understand. This scientific information is valuable in its own right, containing insights and discoveries that have allowed modern researchers to advance their own fields, to solve problems that had stymied them, to see nature from new perspectives that the first civilization had developed through their own unique evolutionary path and cultural history. But the transmission is much more than just a scientific database, much more than a list of facts and formulas and measurements. Woven throughout the technical information is something that might be called philosophy, or wisdom, or perhaps simply advice, guidance from a civilization that had achieved technological mastery about how to use that mastery wisely, warnings about pitfalls and dangers they had observed or experienced, encouragement to pursue certain paths and avoid others. This is perhaps the most controversial and disputed aspect of the transmission, because different researchers interpret these philosophical sections in different ways, seeing in them reflections of their own values and concerns, and there is ongoing debate about whether we are truly understanding what the first civilization meant to convey, or whether we are simply projecting our own thoughts onto an ambiguous text. But taking the most widely accepted interpretations, what emerges is a picture of a civilization deeply concerned with balance and harmony, with maintaining equilibrium between technological capability and wisdom, between individual freedom and collective good, between the drive to change and improve and the need to preserve and protect what is valuable in the present moment. One of the strongest themes running through the philosophical sections of the transmission is what might be called the principle of integration or wholeness, the idea that the greatest danger facing any advanced civilization is fragmentation, the splitting apart of things that should remain connected. The first civilization seems to have believed that their own success, their ability to achieve such an advanced state while maintaining harmony with their world, came from their refusal to separate mind from body, individual from society, civilization from nature, knowledge from ethics, technology from art. They saw all these as artificial divisions that other less successful species had perhaps made, treating each domain as independent, when in fact they were all aspects of a single unified reality that had to be approached holistically. The transmission contains what appear to be cautionary tales about civilizations, whether real or hypothetical we cannot be certain, that had allowed these fragmentations to occur, that had developed powerful technologies without developing equivalent wisdom, that had achieved material abundance without achieving happiness, that had explored the external universe while ignoring their internal landscapes. And in each case, these fragmented civilizations had ultimately failed, collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions, or destroying themselves through misuse of their capabilities. Another major theme is what we might call the recognition of limits, the understanding that not everything that can be done should be done, that power without restraint is ultimately self-destructive. That wisdom consists partly in knowing when not to act. This message seems particularly urgent and relevant to modern humans, as we develop increasingly powerful technologies that give us the ability to modify our own genetics, to reshape our environment, to create artificial intelligence to manipulate the basic building blocks of matter and life. The first civilization had all these capabilities and more, yet they chose to exercise them with great caution and care, always asking not just whether something was possible, but whether it was good, whether it would contribute to the flourishing of life or diminish it, whether it would increase harmony or create discord. The transmission contains what appear to be their ethical frameworks and decision-making processes, showing how they evaluated new technologies and new directions, how they balanced innovation against precaution, how they thought about responsibilities to future generations and to other species with whom they shared the planet. There is a sense throughout these sections that the first civilization had learned through long experience that the relationship between intelligence and power is not straightforward, that more of each does not automatically lead to better outcomes. That wisdom consists partly in self-limitation and voluntary restraint. Perhaps the most profound and moving section of the transmission is the part that deals with consciousness itself, with the mystery of subjective experience, with what it means to be aware and to know that you are aware. The first civilization had apparently spent enormous effort trying to understand consciousness, both their own and that of other organisms. And while they concluded that they could never fully explain it in purely physical terms, never reduce the quality of experience to mere mechanism, they had developed sophisticated frameworks for thinking about it and working with it. They recognized that consciousness was perhaps the most precious thing in the universe, the quality that made existence meaningful, rather than simply factual, and they believed that protecting and nurturing consciousness in all its forms was the highest ethical obligation of any intelligent being. This belief is what ultimately motivated the creation of the transmission itself, their desire to ensure that even though their particular form of consciousness was ending, the insights and wisdom that consciousness had achieved would survive and potentially contribute to future consciousnesses that might arise. They wanted future intelligences to know that they had existed, that they had been aware, that they had looked out at the universe and found it beautiful and terrible and strange, that they had loved and suffered and learned and grown, and they wanted to share what they had discovered about how to live well, how to use intelligence in service of flourishing rather than destruction. The transmission also contains what might be called their cosmology or worldview, their understanding of the nature of the universe and the place of life and intelligence within it. They appear to have believed that the universe was not random or meaningless, but was instead structured in such a way that the emergence of complexity in consciousness was not just possible, but in some sense inevitable. Written into the fundamental laws of physics and chemistry that govern how matter and energy behave, they had observed that the universe seemed fine-tuned for life, with the physical constants and laws being precisely what they needed to be to allow stars to form and planets to exist, and chemistry to become complex enough to support biology. Whether this fine-tuning was the result of design by some higher intelligence, or selection from among many universes in a vast multiverse, or some other explanation they did not claim to know for certain, but they believed it pointed to something profound about the nature of reality, suggesting that we are not cosmic accidents, but rather expressions of a universe that in some sense wants to know itself, that evolves intelligence and awareness as part of its fundamental nature. This view gave their civilization a sense of purpose and connection, a feeling that their existence mattered in a cosmic sense, that by developing consciousness and using it to understand the universe, they were participating in something larger than themselves. As you lie there in the deepening darkness, your breathing slow and rhythmic, let us examine the most troubling part of the genetic transmission, the sections that seem designed not to inform, but to warn, to alert future civilizations to dangers that the first civilization had either experienced themselves or foreseen through their understanding of how technological societies evolve. These warning sequences are encoded with particular emphasis and redundancy, suggesting that the first civilization considered them critically important, perhaps the most important part of the entire message. The warnings cover several distinct but related themes, each dealing with ways that an advanced civilization might undermine or destroy itself even in the absence of external threats, ways that success and capability can paradoxically create the conditions for failure and collapse. Understanding these warnings is challenging because they are expressed through the first civilization's own conceptual frameworks and symbolic language. But as more researchers have worked on the problem, consensus interpretations have begun to emerge that reveal deeply troubling parallels between the dangers they identified and situations that modern human civilization is currently facing. The first major warning concerns what might be called the disconnection crisis, the danger that arises when a civilization's technologies allow individuals to become increasingly isolated from direct contact with nature and with each other. The first civilization seems to have observed or reasoned that biological beings evolved to exist in close connection with the natural world and with other members of their species, that our sensory systems and emotional systems and cognitive systems developed in environments very different from the artificial environments that technology makes possible. They warned that when individuals spend too much time in artificial environments interacting primarily with human-made objects and systems rather than with natural ecosystems, something essential begins to deteriorate in their psychology and physical health. They warned that when communication becomes mediated primarily through technology rather than face-to-face contact, when relationships exist mainly as data transmitted through networks rather than as physical presence and shared experience, the quality of those relationships degrades in subtle but cumulative ways, losing dimensions that are difficult to articulate but critical for well-being. The transmission contains imagery that seems to show individuals surrounded by technological marvels, yet experiencing profound loneliness and disconnection, suggesting that the first civilization had witnessed this pattern and wanted to warn future intelligences about it. The second warning relates to what we might call the complexity trap, the danger that a civilization's own systems and technologies become so intricate and interdependent that they become impossible to manage or understand, even by those who created them. The first civilization seems to have recognized that there is a tendency for technological systems to grow more complex over time, with each generation adding new layers and features and interconnections, until eventually no single individual, and perhaps not even the entire civilization collectively, can comprehend how everything fits together and what the consequences of any particular change might be. They warned that this creates profound vulnerability, because when something goes wrong in such a system, When some unexpected interaction or failure cascade begins, there may be no way to diagnose the problem or implement a solution before catastrophic damage occurs. The transmission contains what appear to be examples or simulations showing civilizations that had built incredibly sophisticated technologies, planetary scale systems for managing resources and energy and information, only to have those systems fail in ways that couldn't be predicted or prevented, leaving the civilization helpless despite all their knowledge and capability. The message seems to be that complexity must be balanced with comprehensibility, that there is wisdom in maintaining systems simple enough that they can be understood and repaired when things go wrong, even if that means foregoing some of the efficiency or capability that greater complexity might provide. A third warning addresses what might be termed the attention fragmentation problem, the danger that arises when information and stimulation become so abundant and so readily available that individuals lose the ability to focus deeply on anything, to engage in the kind of sustained concentration and reflection that is necessary for wisdom and good judgment. The first civilization appears to have understood that consciousness has limited bandwidth, that we can only attend to a small number of things at any given moment, and that the quality of our thinking depends critically on how we allocate that attention. They warned that technological systems designed to capture and hold attention, to constantly provide novelty and stimulation, can hijack the attentional mechanisms that evolved for very different purposes, leaving individuals perpetually distracted, unable to think deeply, or feel deeply, or connect deeply with anything. The transmission seems to suggest that this attentional fragmentation is not just a minor annoyance, but a civilizational threat, because a population whose attention is constantly fragmented will make poor decisions, will fail to notice gradual but important changes in their environment, will be unable to coordinate on large-scale challenges that require sustained focus and commitment. They seem to have believed that maintaining what they called clear seeing or undivided awareness was essential for any civilization that hoped to survive and flourish over long time periods. The fourth warning concerns the danger of optimization without wisdom, the tendency for technological civilizations to become very good at achieving specific goals efficiently, without adequately considering whether those goals are truly valuable, or whether the methods of achieving them create unacceptable side effects. The first civilization seems to have recognized that advanced technology makes it possible to optimize almost any process, to make it faster, or cheaper, or more scalable, but that this optimization is ethically neutral, that it can be applied just as readily to destructive ends as to beneficial ones. They warned about the seductive nature of optimization, how satisfying it is to see systems becoming more efficient, how easy it is to focus on measurable improvements while ignoring impacts that are harder to quantify. The transmission contains what appear to be examples of civilizations that had optimized their resource extraction to the point where they depleted their environments faster than those environments could recover, or that had optimized their manufacturing to the point where waste products accumulated at toxic levels, or that had optimized their information systems to the point where truth and falsehood became indistinguishable, with devastating consequences in each case. The message seems to be that optimization must always be guided by wisdom, by a broader understanding of what truly matters and what kind of world we want to create. Otherwise, we risk becoming very efficient at building things nobody should want. The fifth and perhaps most troubling warning concerns what might be called existential complacency, the danger that a civilization will become so comfortable and secure that it loses the ability to recognize and respond to serious threats, particularly threats that develop gradually over long time periods. The first civilization seems to have observed that success breeds a kind of blindness, that when things have been going well for a long time, there is a natural tendency to assume they will continue going well, to dismiss warnings as alarmist, to prioritize short-term comfort over long-term survival. They recognized that the same qualities that allow a civilization to succeed in stable conditions, the tendency toward routine and established practice and preservation of the status quo, can become fatal weaknesses when conditions begin to change. when new challenges emerge that require flexibility and rapid adaptation. The transmission contains imagery that is particularly haunting, showing civilizations continuing their normal activities even as signs of approaching catastrophe become increasingly obvious, suggesting that one of the greatest dangers is not the inability to see threats, but the refusal to believe them. The psychological defense mechanism that allows individuals and societies to deny reality when that reality is too frightening to accept. They seem to be warning that any civilization that becomes too attached to its current way of life, too invested in the belief that its particular moment represents some kind of endpoint or final achievement, is setting itself up for disaster when inevitable changes occur. Let your eyelids grow heavy now as we explore one of the most extraordinary and unexpected aspects of the genetic transmission. The discovery that it contains not just information that can be read consciously and analytically, but also information that operates at subconscious levels, influencing human psychology and behavior in ways we are only beginning to understand. Researchers studying the transmission noticed that certain sequences seem to have minimal informational content when analyzed mathematically, containing far less data than could be encoded in that number of nucleotides. Yet these sequences were preserved with the same fidelity as the dense information-rich sections, suggesting they served some important function that wasn't immediately obvious. Further investigation revealed that these sequences appeared to be designed to interact with regulatory networks in human development, with the genetic switches that control when and where particular genes are expressed, with the biochemical cascades that shape the developing brain and nervous system. The first civilization had apparently not been content just to leave a message that future intelligences might one day read, but had also found ways to subtly influence the development of those intelligences, to predispose them towards certain ways of thinking and feeling that would make them more likely to survive and flourish. This discovery raised profound ethical questions that continue to be debated in scientific and philosophical circles around the world. Is it appropriate for one civilization to shape the psychology of future civilizations without their consent or even their awareness? Does the fact that the first civilization predates us by hundreds of millions of years and presumably had access to far more knowledge and wisdom than we currently possess justify their attempt to influence our development? Or does the fact that we cannot choose whether to accept this influence, that it was imposed on us before we existed, and is now an inextricable part of what we are, make it a violation of autonomy regardless of how benevolent the intentions behind it? These questions have no easy answers, but what has become increasingly clear as researchers study the regulatory sequences in the transmission is that the first civilization was extremely careful and conservative in what they chose to influence, that they did not try to control or determine human nature, but rather to give us what might be called gentle nudges in directions they believed would serve us well. The primary effect of these regulatory sequences seems to be to enhance certain cognitive and emotional capabilities that are associated with wisdom and long-term thinking. They appear to slightly increase the capacity for empathy, making it easier for humans to imagine and care about the experiences of others, including not just other humans but other species, and even hypothetical future beings who do not yet exist. They seem to strengthen the neural circuits involved in delayed gratification and impulse control, making it somewhat easier to forego immediate rewards in favor of larger long-term benefits. They appear to enhance the ability to perceive and think about complex systems, to see patterns and connections across multiple levels of organization, to understand how changes in one part of a system might ripple through and affect other parts in unexpected ways. They may slightly strengthen the feeling of connection to nature, the sense that we are part of the living world, rather than separate from it, the intuition that what we do to the environment we ultimately do to ourselves. None of these effects are deterministic or overwhelming. They do not take away human free will or force particular choices, but they do subtly shift the probabilities, making choices that align with long-term flourishing slightly more likely, slightly more appealing, slightly more natural feeling than they might otherwise be. Some researchers have suggested that these regulatory influences might help explain certain puzzling aspects of human nature, behaviors and feelings that seem maladaptive from a purely evolutionary perspective, but that make more sense if we understand them as gifts from the first civilization designed to help us avoid the pitfalls that had threatened them. The human capacity for art and music and beauty appreciation, for example, might be partly enhanced by the transmission, might be the first civilization's way of ensuring that we maintain connection to aesthetic and emotional dimensions of experience, rather than becoming purely instrumental and utilitarian in our thinking. The nearly universal human sense that there is something sacred or transcendent beyond the material world, the feeling that existence has meaning even if we struggle to articulate what that meaning is, might be partly a product of regulatory influences designed to prevent the kind of nihilistic despair that might lead a technologically powerful civilization to self-destruct. The capacity for love, particularly the intense attachment between parents and children that makes us willing to sacrifice our own interests for the well-being of the next generation, might be strengthened by transmission influences, ensuring that we naturally care about the future, even when that future will be inhabited by people we will never meet. But perhaps the most significant effect of these regulatory sequences is what some researchers have called the warning sense, a subtle feeling of unease or alarm that seems to activate when humans encounter certain situations or contemplate certain actions. This is not a conscious, explicit warning, but rather a vague intuition, a feeling that something is wrong or dangerous, even when we cannot immediately articulate why. Studies have shown that this warning sense tends to activate in situations that correspond to the dangers described in the explicit warning section of the transmission. Situations involving disconnection from nature, uncontrolled complexity, attention fragmentation, optimization without wisdom, and existential complacency. When humans spend too much time in purely artificial environments, many report feeling vaguely unsettled or depressed even if their physical needs are fully met. When contemplating technologies that would dramatically increase system complexity, many people feel instinctive hesitation even if they cannot rationally justify that hesitation. When experiencing constant fragmentation of attention, many report feeling that something important is being lost, even if modern life seems to demand such fragmentation. The first civilization appears to have found a way to encode their warnings not just in conscious intellectual terms, but in emotional and intuitive terms, giving us an internal guidance system that tries to steer us away from dangerous paths. Not everyone experiences these influences in the same way, or to the same degree, of course. There is natural variation in human genetics and development, and the regulatory sequences from the transmission interact with thousands of other genetic factors and environmental influences to produce the full complexity of human psychology. Some individuals seem to feel these subtle pushes more strongly than others, seem more naturally drawn toward empathy and systems thinking in connection with nature, while others seem to have different makeups that lead them in other directions. But at the population level, across humanity as a whole, the statistical effect of these influences is measurable and significant, shaping our collective behavior in ways that would be different if the transmission were not there. This raises the fascinating possibility that much of what we consider human nature, the particular mix of capabilities and tendencies that makes our species what it is, may have been partly shaped by the first civilization. That we are, in a sense, their descendants, not biologically but informationally, carrying forward their values and insights encoded not in culture or tradition, but in the very structure of our genomes. Feel the gentle weight of sleep beginning to press against your consciousness now, as we venture into the deeper layers of the genetic transmission. The sections that researchers believe were encoded last and contain the most personal and poignant communications from the first civilization to whoever might one day read their message. While the outer layers of the transmission focused on scientific knowledge and practical warnings and subtle psychological influences, these inner layers seem intended for a different purpose, seem to be reaching across time not just to inform or protect, but to connect. to bridge the vast gulf of years in evolutionary distance and establish some kind of relationship between one conscious civilization and another. These sections are harder to decode than the outer layers because they rely less on universal mathematical concepts and more on metaphor and emotion and shared experience, on the hope that despite all the differences between the first civilization and humanity, there are certain fundamental aspects of conscious existence that remain constant, certain feelings and struggles and joys that any aware being must encounter simply by virtue of being aware. One of these inner messages appears to be an attempt to convey what life was like for the first civilization during their peak, during the long period before they knew their world was ending, when they lived in harmony with their planet and each other, and believed their existence might continue indefinitely into the future. The transmission contains something like memories or recordings, though not in any format that maps directly onto human senses, requiring instead a kind of imaginative reconstruction where the encoded patterns are used to guide the generation of experiences that approximate what the first civilization felt and perceived. Researchers who have attempted this reconstruction report being overwhelmed by the beauty and strangeness of what they encounter, by sensations and emotions that seem simultaneously alien and deeply familiar. There are impressions of vast living cities that breathe and grow and adapt to the needs of their inhabitants, of communication that flows directly from mind to mind, without the distortion and limitation of language, of technology that feels more like magical art than machinery, of a relationship with the natural world so intimate that the boundary between self and environment becomes porous and undefined. There is a sense of profound satisfaction and contentment of living in a civilization that has solved most of the problems that create suffering, where resources are abundant and fairly distributed, where each individual can pursue their interests and develop their capabilities without fear or want, where the future seems bright and full of possibility. But intertwined with these impressions of peak civilization are also glimpses of the struggles and challenges that the first civilization faced in reaching that state. The long, difficult process of learning wisdom the hard way, through mistakes and failures and near disasters. The transmission suggests that the first civilization did not simply appear in their advanced state, but evolved toward it over millions of years. That they went through phases much like those that human civilization is currently experiencing. Periods of rapid growth and technological development that created new problems even as they solved old ones. Periods of conflict and competition and environmental damage that threatened to derail their progress toward greater harmony. They experienced their own version of the Industrial Revolution and dealt with pollution and resource depletion and climate change. They went through periods of ideological conflict where different groups within their civilization had radically different visions of what kind of world they should build. They made terrible mistakes, created technologies that caused unintended harm, pursued paths that led to dead ends or near catastrophes. The transmission does not hide or minimize these failures, but presents them openly, perhaps wanting future civilizations to know that the achievement of wisdom and harmony is not easy, that it requires going through difficulties and learning from them, that there is no shortcut to creating a truly flourishing society. One particularly powerful section of these inner layers appears to be a direct address to whoever might eventually read the message, a communication that tries to bridge the temporal gap and create a moment of genuine contact between the first civilization and us. The encoding in this section is subtle and multi-layered, designed to evoke feelings and intuitions rather than to convey explicit information. And different people who engage with it report different experiences. But there are common themes that emerge across many reports: a sense of being welcomed and recognized, of being told that your existence matters, and that the universe is better for your presence in it. There is encouragement to continue developing, to not give up in the face of challenges, to believe that the difficulties you face can be overcome with wisdom and persistence. There is reassurance that the feelings of loneliness and existential uncertainty that seem to afflict all conscious beings are normal and not a sign of failure, that the first civilization felt them too, but perhaps all awareness comes paired with a kind of cosmic homesickness, a sense of being separate from the universe, even as we are part of it. There is an invitation to see yourself as part of a larger story, the story of consciousness awakening in the universe and learning to understand itself. A story that began long before you and will continue long after you, but that would be incomplete without your particular contribution to it. Another inner layer contains what might be called gifts or offerings, things that the first civilization created specifically to be enjoyed and appreciated by future intelligences, even though they themselves would never experience that appreciation. There are encoded works of art, patterns that when properly translated and rendered, create visual and auditory experiences of stunning beauty, compositions that seem to capture something essential about the nature of existence and awareness. There are games and puzzles and challenges designed to stimulate thought and creativity, exercises that can help develop the kind of holistic systems thinking that the first civilization valued. There are meditative practices and contemplative exercises, methods for quieting the busy chatter of the mind and accessing deeper states of awareness, techniques that the first civilization developed over millions of years of exploring consciousness, and that they wanted to share with any future beings who might benefit from them. These gifts are offered freely, without expectation of return or reciprocation, simply because the first civilization wanted to contribute something positive to the universe, to make existence richer and more beautiful for whoever came after them. Perhaps the most moving part of these inner layers is what researchers have come to call the farewell sequence, the final messages encoded by individuals who knew they were among the last of their kind, who were working to complete the transmission even as their world collapsed around them. These messages are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, reflecting the personal perspectives and emotional states of different individuals facing the same existential crisis. Some express profound sadness at all that will be lost, all the beauty and knowledge and relationships that will vanish when the last member of their species dies. Others express something closer to acceptance or even peace, a sense that they have lived well and accomplished much, and that death is a natural part of existence that should not be feared or resisted. Still others express hope, focusing not on their own ending, but on the possibility that the transmission will succeed, that millions or billions of years in the future, someone will read these very words and know that the first civilization existed, that they will carry forward something of what was learned and achieved, that the first civilization will live on, in a sense, through the influence they have on whoever comes after. There is vulnerability in these final messages, an openness and honesty that comes from having nothing left to lose, from wanting to communicate something true and important, even if you cannot know whether anyone will ever hear it. Allow your thoughts to slow and soften now as we contemplate one of the deepest mysteries surrounding the genetic transmission, a mystery that researchers have been grappling with since the very first discovery of the anomalous patterns in DNA. The question is deceptively simple to state, but profound in its implications. Where did the first civilization actually come from, and how did they emerge in the first place? The transmission provides extensive information about what the first civilization was like at their peak, about their technology and culture and values, and eventual decline, but it is strangely reticent about their origins, about the early evolutionary history that produced them, about how they made the transition from whatever animal-like ancestors they evolved from to the advanced state they achieved. This gap in the transmission has been noticed by every research team that has studied it, and there is ongoing debate about whether it represents damage or data loss, or whether it was a deliberate choice by the first civilization to not include that information, and if the latter, what their reasoning might have been. Some researchers argue that the gap is simply a practical matter of limited bandwidth, that the first civilization had only so much information they could encode in DNA, without overwhelming the error correction systems that kept the transmission intact, and they chose to prioritize information about their peak achievement and their hard-won wisdom over historical details about their origins. According to this view, the first civilization probably evolved through perfectly normal biological evolution, perhaps accelerated somewhat by unusual environmental conditions or lucky mutations, but ultimately through the same kinds of processes that produced humans, and they saw no need to document those processes in detail, since any future intelligence would be able to infer them from general principles of evolutionary biology. This interpretation is comforting in a way because it suggests that the emergence of intelligence is a natural outcome of evolution, given enough time, that there is nothing particularly mysterious or special required beyond the normal operation of variation and selection and inheritance, and that humanity's own existence can be understood in similar terms, without needing to invoke unusual explanations. But other researchers find this explanation unsatisfying, pointing to various clues in the transmission that seem to hint at something more complex in the origins of the first civilization. There are references scattered throughout the message to what might be translated as benefactors or teachers or predecessors, entities that are mentioned obliquely but never fully explained, that seem to have played some role in the first civilization's development, but whose nature remains mysterious. Some interpret these references as metaphorical or religious, the first civilization's own creation myths about divine beings or cosmic forces that shaped their existence, not intended to be taken literally, but rather as poetic expressions of wonder at their own existence. Others interpret them more literally, suggesting that the first civilization may have been contacted or influenced by an even earlier intelligence, perhaps an extraterrestrial species that visited Earth hundreds of millions of years ago, or perhaps something stranger still, an intelligence from outside our normal space-time that can interact with biological evolution in ways we don't understand. This interpretation is more speculative and harder to test, but it would explain the gaps in the transmission's account of origins, and would raise the possibility that the genetic transmission we have found is not the first such message, but is itself part of a longer chain of communication, stretching back even further into the past. A third interpretation, perhaps the strangest of all, suggests that the first civilization might have been involved in their own creation in a way that violates our normal understanding of causality and time. This view points to sections of the transmission that seem to describe temporal manipulation or nonlinear causality that suggest the first civilization had developed some understanding of physics that allowed them to influence the past from the future, or to exist in some kind of loop where they were both the cause and effect of their own emergence. According to this interpretation, the first civilization might have used the genetic transmission not just to send information forward in time to future species, but also to send information backward in time to their own ancestors, creating a causal loop where they engineered the very conditions that allowed them to evolve in the first place. This would explain why their emergence seems unusually rapid, and why their technological advancement appears to follow a trajectory that seems almost aimed at reaching the point where they could create the transmission, as if their entire evolutionary history was being subtly guided toward that outcome. This interpretation ventures into territory that most scientists consider speculative at best, and probably impossible, since it requires physics that goes beyond our current understanding. But the mathematical patterns in the relevant sections of the transmission are sufficiently strange that they cannot be easily dismissed. Regardless of which interpretation is correct, the question of the first civilization's origins naturally leads to questions about our own origins and the role that the genetic transmission has played in human evolution. We know that the transmission was inserted into DNA hundreds of millions of years ago, long before any primate existed, long before any mammal existed, carried through countless generations and evolutionary branches in the genomes of organisms that had no awareness of what they carried. But did the transmission simply wait passively in our DNA until we developed the capability to read it? Or has it been actively influencing human evolution all along, shaping our development in ways we have not yet recognized? The regulatory sequences we discussed earlier certainly have some effect on human psychology and development. But could there be other effects that are more profound, more foundational to what we are? Some researchers have speculated that the transmission might have influenced the evolution of human intelligence itself, that the unusual rate at which human brain size and cognitive capability increased over the past few million years might not be explainable by normal selection pressures alone. that the transmission might contain mechanisms that promote the evolution of intelligence in whatever species carry it, ensuring that eventually some lineage will develop the capability to read and understand the message. This leads to an even more unsettling possibility, one that some researchers whisper about in private, but hesitate to publish in academic journals because of how profoundly it would challenge our understanding of human identity and autonomy. What if humanity was not just influenced by the first civilization, but was in some sense created by them, designed to be the recipients and inheritors of their message? What if the particular combination of traits that makes humans unique, our unusual cognitive flexibility, and our capacity for language and abstract thought, and our drive to understand and manipulate our environment, what if all of these were not accidents of evolution or the result of random environmental pressures, but were instead carefully selected for by mechanisms embedded in the genetic transmission? Mechanisms working over millions of years to produce a species that would be capable of receiving and acting on the wisdom the first civilization wanted to convey. In this view, humanity would be less like a natural species and more like a carefully cultivated garden, planted and tended by the first civilization who would never live to see it bloom, but who trusted that their careful preparation would eventually bear fruit. This interpretation is controversial and disturbing to many people, because it seems to rob humanity of our special status, to make us derivative rather than original, to suggest that even our greatest achievements are really just the unfolding of a plan laid down by someone else long ago. Let your muscles relax completely now, releasing every last bit of tension, as we turn to consider the profound ethical questions raised by the existence of the genetic transmission and what it means for how we understand our responsibilities and relationships across vast spans of time. The first civilization was obviously deeply concerned with the future, concerned enough that they devoted their final years and resources to creating a message that might help civilizations that would emerge hundreds of millions of years after they were gone. This suggests a framework of moral consideration that extends far beyond the immediate present, or even the relatively near future, that we typically think about when making ethical decisions. Most human ethical systems are primarily concerned with our obligations to people who currently exist, or who will exist in the relatively near future, perhaps our children, or grandchildren, or great-grandchildren. But even these more expansive frameworks rarely extend their concern more than a few generations forward. The first civilization's actions suggest a moral horizon that extends essentially forever. A recognition that the consequences of our choices do not stop with our deaths or even with the extinction of our species, but continue rippling forward through time, affecting beings we will never meet and can barely imagine. This raises challenging questions about how we should think about our own responsibilities to the deep future, to the civilizations and species that might exist millions or billions of years from now. Do we have any obligations to such distant and hypothetical beings, or is it sufficient to focus our moral concern on the present and near future, where our actions have clearer and more predictable consequences? If we do have obligations to the deep future, what form should those obligations take? What concrete actions should we be taking or refraining from in light of those obligations? The genetic transmission suggests that the first civilization believed they had strong obligations to the future, strong enough to justify enormous sacrifice, but they were facing the extinction of their entire civilization and species, a crisis so absolute that it perhaps justified exceptional actions. Humanity is not currently facing extinction, at least not in the immediate sense. So do the same principles apply to us? Or is there something different about our situation that changes the ethical calculation? One framework for thinking about these questions focuses on what we might call option preservation. The idea that even if we cannot predict what future beings will want or need, we have an obligation to preserve their options, to not foreclose possibilities that they might value. This suggests that actions which cause permanent, irreversible changes, particularly changes that destroy things which can never be recreated, are ethically more serious than actions with temporary or reversible effects. The extinction of species is perhaps the clearest example. Since once a species is gone, its unique evolutionary history and genetic information are lost forever. The universe is permanently impoverished by the loss, and future beings who might have valued that species are denied the option of experiencing or learning from it. Similarly, the destruction of ecosystems, the depletion of non-renewable resources, the creation of long-lived pollution that will persist for thousands or millions of years, all of these represent permanent changes that constrain the options available to future beings in ways that they cannot consent to and may not appreciate. The first civilization's extensive efforts to preserve their knowledge and insights can be seen as an extreme form of option preservation, ensuring that even though they themselves would be destroyed, the information they had gathered and the wisdom they had developed would remain available for future use. Another ethical framework suggested by the transmission focuses on what we might call identity continuity. The recognition that while we cannot know exactly what future beings will be like or what they will want, we can be fairly confident that they will want to exist, that they will value their own existence and the existence of their civilization, and therefore that we have an obligation to not take actions that would prevent them from existing or that would make their existence more difficult or less fulfilling. This is a subtle point because it does not require us to make specific predictions about what future beings will value or how they will live, only to recognize that their existence is valuable and that we should not be cavalier about taking actions that might threaten it. The first civilization's warnings about various civilizational risks can be understood through this framework as attempts to help future civilizations avoid pitfalls that might lead to their premature extinction or collapse, thus preserving the continuity of conscious existence across deep time. By taking their warnings seriously and adjusting our own trajectory to avoid those risks, we are in effect honoring the value of the future people who will exist if we succeed, but who will never exist if we fail. The transmission also raises questions about cultural and informational inheritance across deep time, about what we should try to preserve and pass forward to future civilizations, and what we can allow to be forgotten or lost. The first civilization obviously believed that their scientific knowledge and philosophical insights were worth preserving, worth encoding with such care that they would survive for hundreds of millions of years. But they also preserved art and music and personal messages, things that had no obvious instrumental value. That would not help future beings build better technology or avoid dangers that seem to have been included simply because the first civilization felt they were valuable in themselves and wanted to share them. This suggests that the inheritance we pass to the future should include not just practical information, but also beauty and meaning, and the full range of human experience and achievement. Every time a language goes extinct, every time an artistic tradition is lost, every time some unique human knowledge or practice vanishes, because it was not valued enough to be preserved, we are in effect reducing the richness and diversity of the inheritance that future beings will receive, making their universe a little bit smaller and less interesting than it could have been. But there is also a more troubling aspect to the ethics of deep time communication that the genetic transmission forces us to confront, which is the question of whether it is ever appropriate for one civilization to influence or constrain future civilizations, even with benevolent intentions. The first civilization clearly did influence us through the regulatory sequences they embedded in the transmission, through the subtle nudges they gave to human psychology and development, and while their intentions seem to have been good, aimed at helping us avoid dangers and develop wisdom, we never consented to that influence. We could not consent since we did not exist yet when the choice was made. This raises difficult questions about autonomy and consent across time boundaries. If we develop the capability to influence future civilizations through similar methods, whether through genetic engineering or artificial intelligence or some other technology, do we have the right to use that capability, or should we let the future unfold without our intervention, allowing future beings to make their own choices, even if we believe those choices might lead to suffering or disaster? The fact that we are only now discovering and understanding the first civilization's influence on us, hundreds of thousands of years after modern humans emerged, suggests that influence can be so subtle and so deeply embedded that the influenced party may never realize it is there, may believe they are acting autonomously when in fact their choices are being shaped by decisions made long ago by beings they know nothing about. Feel yourself drifting deeper into restful contemplation now, as we explore how humanity has begun to respond to the discovery of the genetic transmission and what it means for our future development as a species and civilization. The revelation that our DNA contains a message from an ancient civilization has had profound effects on human society, culture, science, and philosophy. Effects that are still unfolding and that will likely shape our trajectory for generations or even centuries to come. The initial response in the scientific community was one of excitement mixed with skepticism, with researchers rushing to verify the findings and confirm that the patterns in DNA really were artificial, rather than some extremely unlikely natural phenomenon. As the evidence mounted and the reality of the transmission became undeniable, that skepticism transformed into something closer to awe, or even religious feeling, a sense that humanity had discovered something truly momentous, something that changed our place in the universe and our understanding of our own nature and origins. For many scientists, the transmission represented confirmation of ideas they had long suspected or hoped might be true, that life and intelligence were not cosmic accidents, but were instead part of a larger pattern or purpose, that we were connected to something greater than ourselves. The impact on religion and philosophy has been equally profound, though more complex and contested. Some religious traditions have embraced the transmission as confirmation of their beliefs, interpreting the first civilization as playing a role similar to that of creator gods or divine beings in their theology, seeing the message in DNA as evidence that existence is not meaningless, but is instead shaped by intelligence and intention operating at cosmic scales. Other religious groups have rejected the transmission or remain deeply uncomfortable with it, seeing it as a challenge to their creation stories and theological frameworks, arguing that the first civilization, whoever they were, cannot be equated with God or the divine, that there must be something beyond and above even them that explains ultimate questions of existence and meaning. Philosophers have engaged in vigorous debates about what the transmission means for long-standing questions about human nature, free will, the possibility of objective moral truth, and the meaning and purpose of existence. The discovery that aspects of human psychology may have been deliberately shaped by the first civilization has revived old arguments about determinism and autonomy, with some arguing that this makes humans less free, and others arguing that the nature of freedom is not changed by knowing that our tendencies and inclinations have an origin in the distant past. In the broader culture, the transmission has captured public imagination in ways that go far beyond its scientific significance, becoming the subject of countless books and films and artistic works that explore its implications and possibilities. There is fascination with the idea of the first civilization itself, with imagining what their world was like, what they looked like, how they lived and loved and thought. There is something profoundly moving about the image of an ancient people, working in their final days to create a message that might survive their extinction, something that speaks to deep human emotions about mortality and legacy and the desire to be remembered. The transmission has become a symbol and metaphor that people use to think about their own lives and choices, asking themselves what message they are encoding through their actions, what they are passing forward to the future through their children and their work and their contributions to society. There is also controversy and argument, as there always is when something challenges existing beliefs and power structures, with debates about how the transmission should be interpreted. Who has the authority to make decisions about it? Whether governments should regulate access to the information it contains, or whether it should be freely available to everyone. The scientific research continues at an accelerated pace, with international collaborations bringing together experts from every relevant field to decode the remaining sections of the transmission that have not yet been fully understood, and to explore the implications of what has already been decoded. New techniques are being developed to read the information more completely and accurately, to reconstruct the imagery and experiences that the first civilization encoded, to understand the regulatory sequences and their effects on human development. There is particular focus on the warning sections of the transmission, with research groups studying whether humanity is currently on trajectories that might lead to the kinds of civilizational risks that the first civilization wanted us to avoid, and if so, what changes we might need to make to our technologies and social structures to reduce those risks. Some researchers are working on ways to communicate back to the first civilization, even though they are long extinct and can never read any response, arguing that there is value in adding our own voice to the genetic record, in encoding information about human civilization into DNA, so that if some future intelligence emerges millions of years from now, they will find not just the first civilization's message, but ours as well, creating a multi-generational conversation across deep time. Perhaps the most significant practical impact of the transmission has been in the realm of technology and policy, where the knowledge encoded in the message is being used to address various challenges facing modern humanity. The first civilization's understanding of physics has led to breakthroughs in energy generation and materials science. Their sophisticated genetic knowledge has advanced medicine and biotechnology. Their insights into complex systems have improved our ability to model and manage everything from ecosystems to economies. Their warnings have influenced policy discussions about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, environmental protection, and other areas where humanity is developing powerful capabilities that need to be guided by wisdom. There is growing recognition that the first civilization gave us not just information, but a framework for thinking about our own development, a set of principles and values that we can use to evaluate whether we are moving in directions that will lead to long-term flourishing or toward the kinds of crises that ended their world. This does not mean blindly following their example or treating their message as infallible scripture, but rather engaging with it seriously and thoughtfully, learning from their experience while also recognizing that humanity faces its own unique challenges in its own unique context. But alongside all these developments, there is also uncertainty and anxiety about what the discovery of the transmission means for humanity's future and whether we will prove capable of living up to the responsibility it implies. The first civilization chose us, in a sense, by encoding their message in DNA and allowing it to propagate through evolution until it reached a species capable of reading it. This was an act of profound trust that whoever eventually found the message would take it seriously, would try to learn from it, would use the knowledge and wisdom it contained to build a better world rather than to increase their capacity for destruction. The question now is whether humanity will prove worthy of that trust, whether we will be able to overcome our own flaws and limitations and short-term thinking, to become the kind of species that the first civilization seemed to believe we could be. This question is not yet answered, and perhaps cannot be fully answered for generations or centuries to come. But the transmission has placed it before us with unavoidable clarity, has made it impossible to claim ignorance or to pretend that our choices do not matter on cosmic timescales. We know now that we are part of a story much larger than ourselves, that other conscious beings have existed and struggled and ultimately failed, that they tried to help us by leaving a message, and that what we do with that message will determine not just our own fate, but perhaps the fate of consciousness itself on this planet, for millions of years to come. Breathe slowly and let the quietness surround you as we venture into the most recently decoded sections of the genetic transmission. The portions that researchers have only begun to understand in the past few years, and that reveal layers of meaning and intention that were not apparent in earlier analyses. These sections are particularly challenging to interpret because they appear to contain information encoded in formats that require not just intellectual understanding, but experiential knowledge. Information that only makes sense once you have lived through certain developmental stages or achieved certain insights about the nature of consciousness and reality. This suggests that the first civilization designed the transmission to be revealed gradually, to unfold its meaning over time, as the receiving civilization matured and develop the capability to understand deeper layers. Like a teaching program that adjusts its content based on the student's progress. The existence of these hidden layers means that our understanding of the transmission is still incomplete and may remain incomplete for decades or generations to come, which is both frustrating and encouraging. Frustrating because we want to know everything now, but encouraging because it means the transmission will continue to yield new insights and guidance as we need them. One of these newly decoded sections appears to contain information about consciousness itself, about the nature of awareness and subjective experience, and how these emerge from physical processes. This has been called the Phenomenology chapter, or the Consciousness Codex by different research groups, and it represents some of the most profound and difficult material in the entire transmission. The first civilization appears to have developed an understanding of consciousness that goes far beyond anything in modern neuroscience or philosophy of mind. Not because they could explain it in purely physical terms, which they conclude is probably impossible, but because they had learned to work with consciousness directly, to explore its properties and possibilities from the inside, rather than just observing it from the outside. The information they encoded includes techniques for altering and expanding consciousness, methods for accessing states of awareness that are not normally available in everyday experience, practices that can reveal aspects of mind and reality that are usually hidden from view. Some researchers who have attempted to reconstruct and practice these techniques report extraordinary experiences describing states of consciousness where the normal boundaries between self and other become porous or dissolve entirely, where time seems to slow down or become nonlinear, where they access what feel like direct intuitions about the nature of reality that cannot be easily translated into words or concepts. This section of the transmission also contains what appears to be the first civilization's conclusions about the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why and how subjective experience arises from physical processes in the brain, why there is something it is like to be a conscious being rather than just information processing occurring in darkness without any experiential quality. Their answer, as far as researchers have been able to decode and interpret it, is both surprising and difficult to articulate clearly. They seem to have concluded that consciousness is not produced by physical processes, but is rather a fundamental aspect of reality itself, something like a field or substrate that exists throughout the universe, and that what brains do is not create consciousness, but rather tune into it, or filter it, or shape it into the particular forms we experience as individual awareness. This view has parallels to various philosophical positions like panpsychism or idealism that have been discussed in human philosophy for thousands of years. But the first civilization apparently had empirical evidence for their conclusions, had developed ways to test and verify these claims that went beyond pure speculation or intuition. If their understanding is correct, it suggests that consciousness is far more widespread in the universe than we typically assume, that it is not limited to biological organisms with complex nervous systems, but is present to some degree in all matter and energy, and that the evolution of complex brains is really about concentrating and organizing consciousness rather than creating it from scratch. Another recently decoded section deals with what might be called cosmological or metaphysical questions, questions about the ultimate nature of reality and the universe we inhabit. The first civilization seems to have developed what we might call a participatory cosmology, a view of the universe as not just a mechanical system operating according to fixed laws, but as something more like an ongoing creative process in which conscious beings play an active role. They believe that observation and measurement and conscious attention do not just passively record what is already there, but actively participate in determining what becomes actual. That, in a deep sense, the universe needs consciousness to complete itself, to transform pure potential into concrete actuality. This has obvious parallels to certain interpretations of quantum mechanics, where the act of observation appears to collapse superpositions and determine outcomes. But the first civilization apparently understood this principle to operate at all scales, not just at the quantum level, suggesting that consciousness is constantly participating in the creation of reality through the choices it makes about what to attend to and how to interpret what it perceives. This view has radical implications for how we understand our relationship to the universe, suggesting that we are not separate observers looking at an external objective reality, but are rather integral participants in an ongoing cosmic creative process, that the universe is in some sense aware of itself through us, that our thoughts and perceptions and choices matter not just for their practical effects, but at a fundamental ontological level. The transmission also contains information about what we might call subtle energies, or fields that the first civilization had learned to detect and work with, but the modern science does not currently recognize or measure. These are not electromagnetic fields or gravitational fields or any of the known forces of physics, but something else, something that apparently plays a role in organizing living systems and perhaps in consciousness itself. The first civilization seems to have developed technologies that could manipulate these fields for various purposes, including healing, communication, and enhancement of consciousness. And they encoded descriptions of these technologies in the transmission, along with warnings about how they could be misused. This is one of the most controversial sections of the transmission, because many scientists dismiss it as misunderstanding or misinterpretation, arguing that there is no evidence for any forces or fields beyond those already known to physics, while others take it more seriously and have begun experimental programs to try to detect and measure whatever the first civilization was describing. The debate continues. But what is clear is that the first civilization believed they had discovered something important about the nature of life and consciousness that was not reducible to known physics and chemistry, and they wanted future civilizations to know about it and potentially develop the capability to work with it themselves. Perhaps the most mysterious of these recently decoded sections is what has come to be called the recursion protocol, or the feedback message, a section that appears to contain instructions for modifying the genetic transmission itself, for adding new information to it, and ensuring that the additions will be preserved and propagated along with the original message. This suggests that the first civilization envisioned the transmission not as a static document, but as a living library that could grow and evolve over time, with each civilization that discovered it adding their own contributions before passing it forward to whoever came next. The technical specifications are extraordinarily complex, requiring genetic engineering capabilities that humanity is only beginning to develop, but the basic principle is clear enough. We are meant to add our own chapter to the story, to encode our own knowledge and insights and experiences into DNA, where they will be preserved for future intelligences to discover. This transforms our relationship to the transmission from passive recipients to active participants, suggesting that the first civilization saw themselves not as the final word on how to live and thrive, but as the beginning of a conversation that would continue across deep time, with each generation of consciousness adding its own voice and perspective, creating a cumulative archive of everything that intelligence has learned about existence. Let your awareness settle into the present moment now, into the world as it currently exists, as we examine how the wisdom encoded in the genetic transmission relates to the specific challenges and crises that humanity is facing in our current time. The parallels between the warnings in the transmission and the trajectory of modern human civilization are striking and troubling, suggesting that we may be repeating patterns that the first civilization tried to alert us to, heading towards some of the same kinds of crises that ultimately contributed to their downfall. This recognition has created a sense of urgency among researchers and policymakers who study the transmission. A feeling that we are running out of time to change course, that the message was not just meant to be studied and admired, but to be acted upon, to be used as a guide for making different choices before it is too late. The question is whether humanity as a whole will be capable of taking the transmission seriously enough to make the difficult changes it suggests, or whether we will dismiss or ignore the warnings, as so many past civilizations have ignored warnings from their own prophets and visionaries, preferring comfortable illusions to uncomfortable truths. The most obvious parallel is with environmental crisis and climate change. The reality that human activity is modifying the Earth's atmosphere and ecosystems, in ways that will have severe and long-lasting consequences. The first civilization's warnings about disconnection from nature and the dangers of treating the environment as a resource to be exploited, rather than a living system to be maintained in balance, seem directly relevant to this situation. They understood through their own experience that a civilization's relationship with its biosphere is not optional or secondary, but is rather fundamental to long-term survival. That you cannot damage or destabilize the ecosystems that support you without ultimately damaging yourself. That the health of the biosphere and the health of civilization are inseparable. They also understood that environmental problems tend to develop gradually and can be ignored or rationalized until they reach crisis proportions, which is exactly what appears to be happening with humanity's response to climate change. The transmission contains detailed information about planetary scale ecosystem dynamics and tipping points, about how environmental systems can appear stable while actually approaching thresholds beyond which they rapidly transition to very different and potentially inhospitable states. This information is being used by climate scientists to refine their models and predictions, but more importantly, it is being used by advocates and activists to try to convey the urgency of the situation, to help people understand that the relative stability we have enjoyed for the past 10,000 years is not guaranteed or permanent, but is rather contingent on maintaining certain conditions that we are actively disrupting. The warning about complexity and system fragility also seems painfully relevant to modern civilization, which has built technological and economic and social systems of extraordinary intricacy and interdependence that few people fully understand and that may be more fragile than we realize. The global economy depends on supply chains that span continents and oceans, on just-in-time delivery systems that leave little margin for error, on financial mechanisms so complex that even experts struggle to predict their behavior. The internet and digital infrastructure that modern society depends on is a vast interconnected network with thousands of points of potential failure and vulnerability to both accidents and deliberate attacks. The food systems that feed billions of people depend on industrial agriculture that in turn depends on complex inputs of energy and chemicals and machinery, all of which could be disrupted by various shocks. The first civilization warned that this kind of complexity creates systemic risk, that it can make societies very efficient under normal conditions, but extremely vulnerable to cascading failures when something goes wrong. And they suggested that resilience requires maintaining diversity and redundancy and local capacity, rather than optimizing everything for maximum efficiency. This advice challenges many of the assumptions that drive modern economic and technological development, which tends to view complexity and interconnection and optimization as positive goods rather than as potential sources of vulnerability. But there is growing recognition among some thinkers and planners that the first civilization may have been right, that we need to consciously choose to maintain some inefficiency and redundancy if we want our systems to be robust and resilient. The attention fragmentation warning resonates deeply with concerns about modern digital technology and social media, which seem designed almost perfectly to capture and fragment human attention in exactly the ways the first civilization cautioned against. The constant stream of notifications and updates and new content, the infinite scroll that always promises something more interesting just a little further down, the algorithms that learn what captures your attention and feed you more of it. All of these work together to make sustained focus and deep thought increasingly difficult for many people. The effects are noticeable in education, where teachers report that students struggle to concentrate on complex material for extended periods. In politics, where serious policy discussions are replaced by sound bites and outrage cycles. In personal relationships, where face-to-face conversation is constantly interrupted by phones and devices demanding attention. The first civilization seems to have understood that attention is a finite and precious resource, that where we direct our attention determines what we can perceive and understand and accomplish, and that technologies which capture attention without providing commensurate value in return are ultimately harmful to individual and collective flourishing. Their message suggests that we need to be much more intentional and protective about how we manage our attention, that we may need to deliberately limit or structure our use of technologies that fragment consciousness, even if those technologies are entertaining or convenient or profitable. The warning about optimization without wisdom applies to numerous areas of modern life, but perhaps most concerningly to artificial intelligence and the drive to create ever more capable AI systems without adequate consideration of their potential impacts and risks. The development of AI is being driven largely by commercial incentives and competitive dynamics, with companies and countries racing to build more powerful systems because they fear being left behind if they do not, with relatively little attention paid to questions of safety or alignment, or whether the systems being created will actually serve human flourishing, or might instead create new problems that outweigh their benefits. The first civilization warned specifically about the dangers of creating optimization systems without embedding them in larger frameworks of value and meaning, without ensuring that what is being optimized actually matters, and that the methods of optimization do not create unacceptable side effects. In the context of AI, this might mean being much more cautious about developing systems that can optimize for specific goals without understanding the broader context or consequences, being very careful about what objective functions we encode and what proxy measures we use, ensuring that AI systems remain under meaningful human control rather than being allowed to operate autonomously in ways that we cannot fully predict or understand. The transmission suggests that the first civilization had experience with powerful optimization technologies and had learned through hard lessons that such tools need to be embedded in wisdom traditions and ethical frameworks that can guide their use. That raw optimization capability without wisdom is not just useless, but actively dangerous. The existential complacency warning is perhaps the most difficult one for humanity to take seriously, because it points to a problem with human psychology itself, with our tendency towards denial and short-term thinking and resistance to changing comfortable patterns, even when we know intellectually that change is necessary. We can see this dynamic playing out in numerous areas, from climate change where the science has been clear for decades but effective action has been repeatedly delayed or watered down, to pandemic preparedness where warnings were ignored until crisis forced a response, to nuclear weapons, where we live with the ongoing risk of catastrophic war, but have largely stopped worrying about it because decades have passed without such a war occurring. The first civilization seems to have recognized that one of the greatest challenges any civilization faces is overcoming its own psychological defenses against acknowledging serious threats. And they encoded not just intellectual warnings, but emotional and intuitive signals designed to activate concern and motivate action. Whether these signals will be strong enough to overcome human tendencies toward complacency remains to be seen. But the transmission makes clear that this is not a problem that can be solved through information alone, that it requires working with human motivation and emotion and social dynamics, creating cultures and institutions that can sustain concern and action over long time periods, even when the threats are not immediately visible. Close your eyes and imagine now what it might be like if humanity one day makes contact with another intelligence, another conscious civilization, somewhere in the vastness of space, and how the existence of the genetic transmission might prepare us for that possibility and inform how we approach such an encounter. The discovery of the transmission has already demonstrated that we are not the first technological civilization to arise in the history of Earth. That intelligence and awareness have emerged before and may emerge again. That consciousness is perhaps more common and more fundamental to the universe than we previously imagined. This realization has changed how many scientists think about the possibility of extraterrestrial intelligence, making it seem less like speculation and more like probability, suggesting that if intelligence has emerged multiple times on Earth alone despite the apparent low probability of the conditions required, then it may have emerged on countless other worlds throughout the galaxy and universe. The question shifts from whether other civilizations exist to how we might recognize them if we encountered them, and what we might learn from such an encounter. The genetic transmission serves as a kind of practice run or test case for thinking about how to communicate with alien intelligence, since the first civilization was in many ways as alien to us as any extraterrestrial species might be, separated by hundreds of millions of years of independent evolution, possessing sensory systems and cognitive architectures and cultural frameworks very different from ours, yet still able to create a message that we can eventually decode and understand. The methods they use to ensure cross-temporal communication, the reliance on universal mathematical principles, combined with symbolic and emotional content that appeals to shared aspects of conscious experience, provides a template that humanity might use if we ever need to communicate with another species, or that we should look for if we are trying to detect messages from other civilizations. The transmission suggests that effective interspecies communication requires multiple levels of encoding, from the purely abstract and mathematical to the personal and experiential, providing entry points for different kinds of understanding and different cognitive strengths, ensuring that even if some aspects of the message are misunderstood or lost, enough will get through to establish contact and begin building shared meaning. But the transmission also provides warnings and guidance about the risks and challenges of interstellar contact, suggesting that the first civilization had thought deeply about these questions, even though they apparently never encountered another spacefaring species themselves. They warn against assuming that any civilization we meet will be similar to us in psychology or values, against projecting our own assumptions and desires onto beings who may be profoundly different, against either excessive fear that sees all aliens as threats, or excessive naivety that assumes all advanced civilizations will necessarily be peaceful and benevolent. They suggest that the relationship between technological advancement and wisdom is not straightforward, that it is possible for a civilization to achieve great technological capability without achieving equivalent ethical sophistication, and therefore that caution and careful evaluation are warranted when encountering unknown intelligences. At the same time, they emphasize the potential value of cross-civilizational contact and learning, the possibility that different evolutionary paths and different perspectives might generate insights and approaches that no single civilization could develop alone, that the meeting of multiple consciousnesses might create something richer and more valuable than any individual consciousness could achieve in isolation. The transmission contains what appears to be a proposed framework or protocol for first contact situations, guidelines for how to approach initial communication with an unknown intelligence in ways that minimize risk while maximizing the possibility of successful interaction. The framework emphasizes patience and gradualness, suggesting that contact should proceed slowly through multiple stages, beginning with simple signals that establish the presence of intelligence and the desire to communicate, then moving to more complex exchanges only as mutual understanding develops and trust is established. It recommends extensive observation and listening before attempting to transmit to try to understand something about the other civilization's context and concerns before imposing your own agenda or perspective. It warns against revealing technological information or capabilities too quickly, since such revelations could shift power dynamics in ways that undermine trust or create incentives for exploitation. It suggests that early communication should focus on universal experiences and emotions, rather than abstract concepts, on establishing empathy and recognition of shared consciousness before attempting to convey complex ideas or negotiate practical arrangements. Perhaps most interestingly, the transmission suggests that if humanity does make contact with another civilization, one of the most valuable things we could share with them would be the genetic transmission itself, the message from the first civilization that has shaped our own development. This would serve multiple purposes. It would demonstrate humanity's willingness to share knowledge rather than hoard it. It would provide the contacted civilization with insights and wisdom that might be valuable to them, and it would potentially create a basis for shared understanding, since both civilizations would be engaging with the same message and could compare their interpretations and responses. The first civilization seems to have envisioned the transmission not just as a message from them to us, but as the beginning of a multi-generational conversation that might eventually include many civilizations across the galaxy, each adding their own chapter and insights, creating a cumulative repository of everything that conscious beings have learned about existence and how to live well. In this vision, the transmission becomes a kind of cultural commons or collective wisdom tradition for consciousness itself, transcending the boundaries of individual species and civilizations, connecting all aware beings across space and time in a shared project of understanding and mutual enrichment. This possibility raises profound questions about humanity's responsibility to preserve and transmit the message, not just into our own future, but potentially to other civilizations we might encounter. If the first civilization trusted us with their message, if they went to such extraordinary lengths to ensure it would reach us intact, do we have an obligation to ensure it continues to propagate, to make it available to any other intelligences we meet, to add our own insights and pass the whole thing forward? And if we do have such an obligation, how should we fulfill it? What technical and social mechanisms do we need to create to ensure the message survives and continues to be valued and understood across multiple civilizational generations? These are not just abstract philosophical questions, but practical challenges that require thought and planning and commitment. Recognition that we are part of a chain of communication and inheritance that extends far beyond our individual lifetimes or even our species' lifetime, that we have received a gift from the deep past and have a responsibility to pass an equivalent gift forward to the deep future. Allow yourself to sink into deep comfort now as we explore what it means to live in a world where the genetic transmission exists, where every human being carries within their cells a message from a civilization that died hundreds of millions of years ago, and how this knowledge might change how we think about ourselves and our place in the cosmos. For most of human history, we lived without knowing the transmission was there, without any awareness that our DNA contained anything beyond the instructions for building and maintaining our bodies. And in a practical sense, nothing has changed. Our DNA functions exactly the same whether we know about the transmission or not. But psychologically and philosophically, everything has changed because we now know that we are connected to something much larger and older than ourselves, that we are recipients of a gift and inheritors of a responsibility, that our existence has been shaped by choices made in the unimaginably distant past by beings we can barely conceive. This knowledge cannot be unknown once learned, cannot be put back into the box, and so we must all grapple with what it means and how it should influence the choices we make both individually and collectively. For some people, the discovery of the transmission has been profoundly meaningful and positive, providing a sense of connection and purpose that they felt was missing from their lives before. The knowledge that we were deliberately given gifts and guidance by an ancient civilization can feel like being part of a family or tradition that extends across deep time, like having ancestors whose wisdom is available to guide us, even though they are long gone. The realization that our psychological tendencies toward empathy and long-term thinking and connection with nature may have been enhanced by the first civilization can make those tendencies feel more valid and important, can provide additional motivation to cultivate and honor them rather than suppressing them in favor of more immediately practical concerns. For people who had struggled with feelings of meaninglessness or cosmic loneliness, who felt that human existence was just a random accident in an indifferent universe, the transmission offers an alternative narrative, a sense that consciousness and awareness are deeply woven into the fabric of reality, that we matter in some objective cosmic sense, because other conscious beings cared enough about the future to try to help us to reach across vast gulfs of time to offer guidance and support. But for others, the transmission has created anxiety or distress, has raised questions about identity and autonomy that are difficult to resolve. Some people feel manipulated or violated by the knowledge that aspects of their psychology were shaped by the first civilization without their consent, feel that their thoughts and feelings are less authentically their own if they were influenced by deliberate design rather than emerging purely from natural evolution. There are debates about whether we should try to remove or neutralize the regulatory sequences from the transmission to restore ourselves to whatever we would have been without their influence. Though most scientists believe this would be impossible without causing severe damage to human development and function, since the regulatory sequences are deeply integrated into our genomes and have been for millions of years. Others worry about determinism, about whether the existence of the transmission means that human history is somehow scripted or predetermined, that we are just acting out a program written by the first civilization rather than genuinely choosing our own path. These concerns are understandable even if they may be based on misunderstandings of how the transmission actually works, and they deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal. The transmission has also created new forms of social division and conflict, with different groups interpreting its significance and implications in incompatible ways. Some people advocate for treating the transmission as something like sacred scripture, as the closest thing we have to objective guidance from a higher source, and believe that humanity should organize itself around the principles and values encoded in the message, that we should use the first civilization's wisdom as the foundation for our ethics and governance and social structures. Others resist this view, arguing that the transmission is interesting and valuable but should not be treated as authoritative, that humanity needs to find its own path based on its own experience and values, rather than trying to imitate or follow a civilization that existed in a completely different context, hundreds of millions of years ago. There are political movements that have formed around different interpretations of the transmission, with some emphasizing the warnings about environmental damage and calling for dramatic changes to industrial civilization, while others emphasize the technical information and call for accelerated technological development. And still others focus on the spiritual and consciousness-related content and advocate for social structures that prioritize inner development and awakening over material advancement. Educational systems around the world have been grappling with how to teach the transmission to young people, how to convey its significance without overwhelming children with concepts and information they are not developmentally ready to understand, how to present different interpretations fairly without privileging one over others, how to help students develop their own relationship with the message rather than simply accepting whatever their teachers or parents believe about it. Some schools have created curricula that introduce aspects of the transmission gradually across multiple years, beginning with simple concepts about deep time and evolution and communication in elementary school, then gradually adding more complex material about the first civilization, and their message as students mature and develop the cognitive tools to engage with it. Other schools teach it primarily in the context of science classes, focusing on the molecular biology and information theory and astrophysics involved in creating and decoding the message. Still others approach it through humanities classes, examining the philosophical and ethical questions it raises, and comparing different cultural and religious responses to the discovery. At the personal level, individuals are finding their own ways to integrate the transmission into their understanding and practice, their daily lives and relationships and choices. Some people have developed meditation or contemplative practices around the transmission, spending time reflecting on the ancient civilization and their message, trying to develop a felt sense of connection across time, sometimes imagining conversations with the first civilization, or trying to perceive the subtle influences their regulatory sequences might be having on consciousness and perception. Others engage with the transmission more intellectually, studying the decoded sections in detail, following the latest research and debates, thinking carefully about how the wisdom and warnings might apply to their own lives and their society. Still others interact with it primarily aesthetically, listening to the reconstructed music of the first civilization or viewing the encoded artworks, finding beauty and meaning in these ancient expressions of consciousness even without fully understanding their original context or intent. There is no single right way to relate to the transmission, no official doctrine or practice that everyone must follow, and this diversity of engagement is probably healthy, probably closer to what the first civilization intended than any kind of rigid orthodoxy would be, since they seem to have valued diversity and individual development rather than uniformity. Let your mind drift freely now through the remaining mysteries of the genetic transmission, the sections that have not yet been fully decoded or understood, the puzzles that still perplex researchers, and hint at depths of meaning that remain to be discovered. Despite decades of intensive study since the initial discovery, scientists estimate that they have decoded perhaps 60 or 70% of the transmission's content, with significant portions still resistant to interpretation or translation. Some of these undecoded sections appear to be damaged or corrupted beyond recovery, victim to mutations and genetic drift that even the first civilization's sophisticated error correction systems could not completely prevent across hundreds of millions of years. But other sections appear intact, their data preserved with high fidelity. Yet their meaning remains opaque because we lack some key insight or framework or experiential reference point that would allow us to understand what the first civilization was trying to convey. These undecoded sections are simultaneously frustrating and tantalizing. Frustrating because we know they contain important information that we cannot access. Tantalizing because they promise that there is still much more to learn from the transmission, that our understanding will continue to deepen and evolve as we develop new tools and perspectives. One particularly enigmatic section has been nicknamed the silent chapter because it appears to contain enormous amounts of information when analyzed mathematically, showing high complexity and low redundancy that indicates dense data encoding. Yet every attempt to decode it has failed to produce anything that makes sense or seems meaningful. The data is clearly structured and patterned rather than random noise, but the structure does not match any of the encoding schemes used in other parts of the transmission, and none of the decoding approaches that have worked elsewhere seem to work here. Some researchers speculate that this section might require future technology to decode, that it might contain information about physics or consciousness, or reality that we cannot understand with our current scientific framework, that the first civilization deliberately encoded it in a way that would be impenetrable until we reached a certain level of development. Others suggest it might be an intentional puzzle or test, something the first civilization included to challenge and stimulate future intelligence, to ensure that we continue developing our capabilities rather than becoming complacent after decoding the easier sections. Still others wonder if it might be damaged in a subtle way that makes it appear intact but actually scrambles the meaning, or if it might be encoded using quantum or biological computational processes that cannot be reconstructed through pure information theoretic analysis. The silent chapter remains one of the great outstanding mysteries of the transmission, a reminder that for all we have learned, there is still much we do not know. Another puzzling aspect of the transmission is what researchers call the reference problem, the question of whether certain encoded sequences are pointing to or referencing things external to the transmission itself, things that we might be able to discover or verify independently if only we understood what we were being directed to look for. There are sections that seem to contain astronomical coordinates and time references, potentially identifying specific stars or regions of space that might be significant in some way, perhaps locations where the first civilization sent other messages or artifacts, perhaps places where other intelligences might be found, perhaps just locations of interesting natural phenomena that the first civilization wanted to draw our attention to. Following up on these potential references, building telescopes and space probes capable of observing or reaching the indicated locations. And so far, the few attempts that have been made have not produced definitive results, but the possibility remains tantalizing. There are also sections that seem to reference information encoded in other biological systems, perhaps in the DNA of other species, or in the physical structure of ecosystems, suggesting that the genetic transmission in human DNA might be just one component of a much larger, distributed message scattered across the biosphere. Some researchers are conducting large-scale surveys of genomes from many species looking for additional, encoded information, while others are studying whether certain patterns in ecosystems or geological formations might contain information placed there by the first civilization. The transmission also appears to contain something that might be called meta-information, information about information itself, frameworks for thinking about knowledge and truth and certainty that are more sophisticated than the epistemological systems humanity has developed. This meta-information is particularly difficult to decode because understanding it requires changing how we think about thinking, requires stepping outside our normal cognitive frameworks in ways that are challenging and disorienting. The first civilization seems to have recognized that different kinds of knowledge require different approaches and have different degrees of certainty. That empirical observation is excellent for some questions but inadequate for others. That logical reasoning is powerful but limited by its axioms and assumptions. That direct experience provides a kind of knowledge that cannot be captured in words or symbols. They appear to have developed a sophisticated multimodal epistemology that integrates insights from science, philosophy, contemplation, and direct experiential exploration. And they tried to encode this epistemology in the transmission so that future civilizations could benefit from it. But conveying how to think about knowledge through encoded sequences in DNA is extremely challenging. Perhaps one of the hardest communication problems the first civilization faced, and we are only beginning to grasp what they were trying to teach us about the nature and limits of knowledge itself. There are also what might be called experiential gaps, sections of the transmission that seem to require certain direct experiences in order to be properly understood, experiences that humanity has not yet had and may not be able to have without developing new technologies or practices. Some of these appear to relate to altered states of consciousness, to forms of awareness and perception that are not accessible in normal waking consciousness, but require meditation or psychotropic compounds or direct neural stimulation to achieve. The first civilization seems to have had sophisticated practices for working with consciousness, for deliberately inducing and exploring various states of awareness, and they encoded descriptions of these states and the insights they provide in the transmission. But these descriptions are difficult to comprehend if you have not experienced something similar yourself. Like trying to explain color to someone who has been blind from birth, or music to someone who has been deaf. The words and concepts can point toward the experience, but cannot fully convey it. Other experiential gaps appear to relate to social or collective phenomena, to forms of group consciousness, or societal organization that the first civilization had achieved, but that humanity has not yet developed, making their descriptions of these phenomena difficult to interpret correctly, because we lack the experiential reference point to understand what they are talking about. The ongoing work of decoding continues at research centers around the world, with new techniques and approaches constantly being developed and tested. Machine learning systems are being trained on the decoded sections to try to recognize patterns and encoding schemes that human researchers might miss, to extrapolate from what we know to what we do not know yet, to generate hypotheses about the meaning of undecoded sections that can then be tested. Interdisciplinary teams are bringing together experts from fields as diverse as molecular biology, linguistics, archaeology, computer science, physics, and mysticism, recognizing that solving the remaining puzzles will require insights and perspectives from many domains. There are collaborative frameworks allowing researchers to share their findings and build on each other's work. And there is a growing sense that decoding the transmission is not just a scientific project, but a civilizational project, something that will continue for generations and that will require sustained commitment and resources if it is to succeed. The transmission is in many ways a gift that keeps giving, a source of insight and inspiration and challenge that will likely remain productive for as long as humanity exists and continues to develop new capabilities and perspectives that allow us to see deeper into its meaning. Feel yourself floating now in the space between waking and sleeping, that liminal state where the boundaries of time become fluid, and you can imagine the vast sweep of years stretching out before us. As we contemplate what the far future might hold for humanity and for the genetic transmission that has become part of our inheritance and identity. The first civilization looked forward across hundreds of millions of years when they created the transmission, imagining civilizations that would be as far removed from them as they were from the earliest multicellular life forms. And now we must do the same, must think about the deep future and what it might hold, what role we might play in the ongoing story of consciousness and intelligence in the universe. This is not an easy task, because the future is genuinely open and uncertain, because our choices and actions will help determine what it becomes. But it is a necessary task if we are to live up to the responsibility that comes with being receivers and carriers of the transmission, with being part of a chain of communication and learning that extends across deep time. One possible future is that humanity successfully heeds the warnings in the transmission and makes the changes necessary to create a stable, sustainable, flourishing civilization that persists for millions of years into the future. In this vision, we learn to live in balance with our biosphere, maintaining technological capability while also maintaining the health of ecosystems and the diversity of species that share the planet with us. We develop forms of social organization that balance individual freedom with collective well-being, that allow for diversity and experimentation while maintaining enough coherence and coordination to address large-scale challenges. We continue to advance our scientific understanding while also deepening our wisdom, ensuring that our growing capabilities are guided by ethics and long-term thinking rather than short-term gains and narrow interests. We learn to work effectively with the subtle aspects of consciousness and reality that the first civilization tried to point us toward, developing practices and technologies that enhance awareness and connection rather than fragmenting them. In this future, the genetic transmission remains a touchstone and reference point, something each generation studies and learns from, adding their own insights and experiences to create an ever richer understanding. Humanity might eventually add our own chapter to the transmission, encoding information about what we learned and achieved, passing it forward to whatever species or civilizations come after us, fulfilling the role that the first civilization envisioned for us as carriers and contributors to an ongoing multi-generational conversation. Another possible future is darker, one where humanity fails to adequately respond to the warnings in the transmission and suffers various catastrophes and collapses as a result. In this vision, environmental damage reaches critical tipping points, creating feedback loops that make the planet less hospitable to complex life, leading to mass extinctions and the breakdown of ecosystems that support human civilization. Or perhaps technological risks that we fail to adequately manage, artificial intelligence that escapes control, or biotechnology that creates pandemics, or nanotechnology that runs amok, or nuclear weapons that are eventually used in global conflict. Any of these could create civilizational collapse, or even human extinction. In this dark future, the genetic transmission would persist in the DNA of whatever species survived the catastrophe, waiting in silence for another million or 100 million years, until conditions allowed another intelligence to emerge and attempt again what humanity failed to achieve. Another chance to decode the message and learn from the first civilization's wisdom. Another opportunity to create a flourishing, sustainable civilization that could endure. This possibility is sobering and tragic, but it is not inevitable. The future is not yet written, and our choices matter enormously in determining which path we follow. A third possible future involves humanity transcending our current biological form, using genetic engineering or cybernetic enhancement or complete digital uploading to transform ourselves into something quite different from the humans we are today. In this vision, we might modify our own DNA deliberately, removing limitations and adding capabilities, perhaps even modifying or removing the genetic transmission itself, choosing to release ourselves from the influence of the first civilization and determine our own nature completely. Or we might abandon biological form entirely, transferring our consciousness into artificial substrates that are more durable and flexible than flesh, creating digital or robotic entities that can survive conditions that would kill biological organisms, that can persist for millions or billions of years without aging or dying, that could potentially spread across the galaxy and beyond. In this transhuman or post-human future, the relationship to the genetic transmission becomes ambiguous, because we would no longer be carrying it in our DNA if we no longer have DNA, though we might choose to preserve it in other forms, or to carry its information and values forward in whatever new substrate we inhabit. The first civilization might have anticipated this possibility, might have understood that biological form is not the only option for consciousness, and their message might contain guidance about how to navigate such transitions without losing what is essential and valuable about awareness and experience. A fourth possible future involves humanity making contact with other intelligent civilizations, either by detecting signals from extraterrestrial sources or by venturing out into space ourselves and encountering other beings on their own worlds. In this future, the genetic transmission becomes a shared reference point, something that humanity can offer to other civilizations and that might help establish common ground and mutual understanding across the barriers of biology and culture and evolutionary history. We might discover that other civilizations have their own versions of the transmission, their own messages from ancient precursors, creating a network of deep time communications that spans the galaxy, connecting multiple lineages of consciousness in a vast extended conversation about the nature of existence and how to live well. Or we might find that we are alone, that intelligence is far rarer than we hoped, that the first civilization and humanity are the only two that have arisen in our region of the galaxy, making the preservation and propagation of the transmission even more precious and urgent because it represents such a rare achievement. In either case, the experience of making contact with truly alien intelligence would profoundly change how we understand ourselves and our place in the cosmos, would provide new contexts and perspectives for interpreting the transmission, would open possibilities that we cannot fully imagine from our current limited vantage point. A fifth possible future, perhaps the strangest to contemplate, involves discovering that the transmission contains information or capabilities that we have not yet suspected, that opens doors to realities or possibilities beyond our current scientific understanding. Perhaps the decoded sections about consciousness and subtle fields point toward real phenomena that, once properly understood and worked with, allow forms of communication or travel or manipulation of reality that seem like magic from our current perspective. Perhaps the first civilization discovered how to work with the underlying structure of space-time or matter or consciousness in ways that allowed them to transcend some of the limitations we assume are absolute. And they encoded that knowledge in the transmission for us to discover once we are ready. In this future, humanity's trajectory might be radically altered by these discoveries, opening vistas of possibility that we cannot currently conceive, perhaps allowing us to achieve things that the first civilization themselves did not achieve, to go further and deeper in understanding and capability than they could in their own time. This is the most speculative and uncertain of the possible futures, but the existence of the undecoded sections of the transmission, particularly the silent chapter, suggests that there may be surprises and revelations still waiting to be discovered that will change what we think is possible. Let yourself relax completely now, feeling your body heavy and still, as we turn from the large-scale future to the personal and intimate present, to what it means for you as an individual to know that the genetic transmission exists within your cells, to carry within yourself a message from the deep past and a potential legacy for the deep future. This is not just an abstract scientific discovery or a fascinating historical curiosity, but something that touches you personally and directly, that is literally part of your physical being, that connects you to stories and struggles and achievements that span hundreds of millions of years. The question is how this knowledge should inform the way you live your life, the choices you make, the values you cultivate, the legacy you leave behind. There is no single answer that applies to everyone, no prescribed response or correct interpretation, but there are questions worth contemplating, perspectives worth considering, as you find your own way of integrating this extraordinary reality into your understanding of yourself and your place in the world. One way to think about it is through the lens of inheritance and responsibility, recognizing that you are the heir to an incredible gift, to knowledge and wisdom carefully preserved across unimaginable spans of time, to subtle influences on your psychology and development that predispose you toward empathy and long-term thinking and connection with the world. This inheritance comes with responsibilities, with an obligation to take seriously what you have been given, to learn from it and to pass it forward in your own way to the next generation. This does not mean you must devote your entire life to studying the transmission or that you must radically change how you live, but it does suggest an attitude of gratitude and stewardship, an awareness that you are part of something larger than yourself, that your choices ripple forward in time just as the first civilization's choices ripple forward to touch you. It suggests that you should think carefully about what kind of world you are helping to create, what kind of legacy you will leave behind, not just for your immediate descendants, but for the long chain of beings that will come after you. Beings whose existence will be shaped by the world you help to build today. Another perspective focuses on connection and kinship, on the profound reality that you are related to every living thing on this planet, not just through common evolutionary ancestry, but through shared inheritance of the genetic transmission. Every plant and animal and microorganism carries some version of the message from the first civilization, making all of life on Earth participants in this vast multi-million-year project of preserving and propagating information across time. This can change how you relate to the natural world, making other species feel less like resources or scenery and more like distant relatives, fellow carriers of an ancient legacy, partners in a shared journey through time. It can deepen your sense of belonging to the biosphere, your awareness that you are not separate from nature, but intimately woven into the fabric of life on this planet. That what you do to other species and ecosystems, you are in a sense doing to yourself and your own family. This perspective might encourage more care and respect in how you interact with the environment, might make conservation and protection of biodiversity feel more personal and urgent, might help overcome the sense of separation and alienation from nature that is so common in modern industrial societies. A third perspective emphasizes meaning and purpose, the way that the existence of the transmission can provide a sense that your life is part of a larger story with cosmic significance. Many people struggle with feelings of meaninglessness, with the sense that human existence is just a random accident in an indifferent universe, that nothing really matters in the grand scheme of things. The transmission offers a counter-narrative to this nihilistic view, demonstrating that consciousness and awareness are precious enough that beings who possess them went to extraordinary lengths to preserve and propagate them, that the universe is not indifferent, but is rather structured in such a way that intelligence and meaning can emerge and persist, that your existence is part of a pattern or purpose that transcends your individual life. This does not require believing in traditional religion or supernatural intervention, does not require faith in anything beyond what the physical evidence of the transmission itself demonstrates. But it does offer a framework for seeing your life as meaningful and valuable in an objective rather than purely subjective sense. You are not just a collection of atoms that will eventually disperse, but a carrier of consciousness and awareness that has persisted for billions of years, and that you have the opportunity to pass forward to the future in enriched and enhanced form. The transmission also invites personal exploration and development, particularly around the aspects dealing with consciousness and the practices for expanding and deepening awareness. Many people report that engaging with these sections of the transmission has been transformative, has opened up dimensions of experience and understanding that they did not know existed, has helped them develop capacities for perception and insight that enrich every aspect of their lives. You might choose to explore some of the contemplative practices or consciousness techniques that the first civilization encoded, to see for yourself whether they produce the benefits and insights that are described. This is not about accepting anything on faith or authority, but about personal experimentation and verification, about developing your own direct understanding through experience rather than just intellectual knowledge. The first civilization seems to have believed that consciousness is the most important thing in the universe, the quality that makes existence meaningful, and they develop sophisticated methods for exploring and enhancing it. These methods are available to you if you choose to engage with them, offering possibilities for personal growth and development that go beyond what mainstream modern culture typically emphasizes. At the same time, it is important to maintain perspective and balance, to not become so focused on the transmission that you lose sight of the immediate present and the simple human joys and relationships that make life worth living. The first civilization's message is valuable and important, but it is not the only source of wisdom or meaning, and it should complement rather than replace your own experience and judgment and the wisdom traditions of your own culture and community. You are not obligated to organize your entire life around the transmission, and there is no shame in engaging with it lightly or occasionally rather than making it a central focus. The message has been waiting for hundreds of millions of years and will continue waiting for however long it takes for you to engage with it at your own pace and in your own way. What matters is not the intensity or frequency of your engagement, but the sincerity and authenticity, the genuine desire to learn and grow, and contribute to the ongoing story of consciousness becoming aware of itself and learning to flourish across deep time. Feel yourself drifting deeper now into that space between thoughts, that quiet, empty fullness where time seems to slow and expand, as we consider one final perspective on the genetic transmission, perhaps the most profound and mysterious of all. The possibility that this entire pattern might repeat, that the cycle of civilizations rising and encoding messages and falling might be something that has happened before and will happen again. That we are part of an eternal return where consciousness emerges and evolves and reaches out across time in a pattern that may have no beginning and no end. Some sections of the transmission hint at this possibility, containing references to cycles and spirals and eternal recurrence, suggesting that the first civilization may have believed they were not truly the first, but were themselves inheritors of an even older message, carriers of wisdom that had already passed through many hands and would continue passing through many more. If this is true, then the question of ultimate origins becomes even more mysterious and profound, because it suggests that there may be no ultimate origin, no first cause or beginning point, but rather an infinite regress, or perhaps a closed loop where the effect somehow creates its own cause. This idea is strange and difficult to wrap our minds around because it violates our normal understanding of time and causality, our assumption that every effect has a prior cause, and that if you trace the chain of causation back far enough, you must eventually reach a beginning. But physics has long suggested that time may not work the way our intuitions suggest, that at fundamental levels the distinction between past and future may be less absolute than it seems, that causality might be more flexible and complex than simple linear chains of cause and effect. The first civilization's understanding of time and causality, as encoded in the transmission, seems more sophisticated than our current scientific frameworks, suggesting they had discovered or understood something about the nature of temporal reality that we have not yet grasped. If they are right, if time is indeed more circular or recursive than we think, then the genetic transmission might be part of a pattern that has repeated many times before and will repeat many times again, with each iteration adding its own contribution to an ever-growing repository of wisdom and insight. This cyclical view has both comforting and unsettling implications. On one hand, it suggests that consciousness and intelligence are not fragile accidents that might easily be snuffed out, but are rather fundamental aspects of how the universe operates, patterns that will inevitably reassert themselves even after apparent endings and extinctions. No matter what catastrophes occur, no matter what civilizations fall, the pattern will eventually recur. Consciousness will emerge again, intelligence will develop and create, and leave its message for those who come after. This provides a kind of cosmic reassurance, a sense that the project of consciousness knowing itself and learning to flourish is not dependent on any single species or civilization succeeding, that the universe will keep trying, will keep generating new opportunities for awareness and understanding to develop. On the other hand, the cyclical view can seem tragic or futile, suggesting that we are doomed to repeat the same patterns over and over, that every civilization will ultimately fail and be replaced by another that will also eventually fail, that there is no ultimate progress or final achievement, but only endless repetition. The first civilization reached such heights of wisdom and capability, yet they still ultimately went extinct, still faced a crisis they could not overcome. And if the cycle repeats, then presumably we will face similar fates no matter how wise or capable we become. But perhaps this tragic interpretation misses something essential about the cyclical view. Perhaps the point is not to achieve some final state of perfection or completion, but rather to participate fully in each iteration of the cycle, to contribute what we can to the ongoing process, to experience and create and love and learn for however long our moment lasts. The first civilization chose to encode their message and send it forward not because they believed doing so would allow them to escape the cycle or achieve immortality, but because it was meaningful to them to contribute, to add their voice to the conversation, to help whoever came next, even knowing that help could never be complete or final. In this view, the value is not in reaching some endpoint, but in the journey itself, in the quality of our participation, in how fully we embrace our moment, and how well we use our brief time to create beauty and meaning and increased awareness. We are part of a pattern that is larger than ourselves, and that will continue with or without our particular contribution. But that does not make our contribution meaningless. Rather, it situates our meaning within a larger context, connects our individual and civilizational story to a cosmic story of consciousness gradually awakening to itself across vast spans of time. The eternal return perspective also changes how we think about death and ending, both individual and civilizational. From a purely linear view, death is tragic loss, the absolute end of something that can never be recovered or replaced. But from a cyclical view, death is transformation, the necessary dissolution that makes room for new growth and new forms, the turning of the wheel that allows the pattern to continue. The first civilization died, but their essence, their knowledge and wisdom and values persist in the transmission and in the influence they have on us, and through us they live again in transformed form, their consciousness continuing in a new body, a new species, a new iteration of the eternal pattern. When we eventually pass, whether as individuals or as a civilization, we too will be transformed. Rather than simply ending, our contributions will persist and influence whatever comes next, and in that sense we will continue, not as separate unchanging selves, but as waves in an ocean that keeps moving long after any particular wave has dissolved back into the greater whole. This perspective invites a particular kind of acceptance and peace, a recognition that our role is not to solve every problem forever, but to do our part in our moment, to carry the pattern forward a little further, to add what we can to the cumulative wisdom of consciousness across time. The first civilization could not prevent their own extinction, but they could and did ensure that something of value would survive them and influence the future. We face our own challenges and crises, some of which we may not overcome, but we too can ensure that something of value persists, that we contribute to the ongoing story rather than simply being lost without trace. This does not require perfect wisdom or flawless execution, does not demand that we solve every problem or avoid every mistake, only that we engage sincerely and do our best with what we have, that we remain open to learning and growing, that we care about something beyond our immediate self-interest and work toward its realization. In the grand cycle of consciousness emerging and evolving and reaching out across time, this is enough. This is all any being or civilization can do, and it is sufficient to justify our existence and make our moment meaningful. Let yourself settle now into complete stillness, your breathing slow and even, your muscles releasing all remaining tension. As we come to the end of our journey through the story of the genetic transmission and what it means for humanity and for you personally, we have traveled together across hundreds of millions of years, from the time of the first civilization, through the long silence of their extinction and the gradual evolution of new forms of life, through the emergence of humanity and our discovery of the message they left behind, forward into possible futures that branch and diverge in ways we can barely imagine. Throughout this journey, one theme has remained constant, the theme of consciousness reaching out across time to touch other consciousness, the theme of intelligent beings trying to communicate and connect, despite the vast gulfs of years and evolutionary distance that separate them, The theme of each generation of awareness trying to help and guide the next, despite knowing they will never meet and never receive thanks or acknowledgement for what they give. You are part of this story now, whether you choose to be or not, simply by being human, by carrying in your DNA the message that the first civilization encoded there hundreds of millions of years ago. Their story is part of your story. Their choices have shaped who you are in subtle but real ways. Their wisdom is available to you if you choose to seek it out and learn from it. But you are also part of the ongoing story, the chapter that is being written right now through the choices humanity makes collectively and through the choices you make individually. The future is not yet determined. We do not know which of the possible paths we will follow, whether humanity will successfully heed the warnings in the transmission and create a flourishing, sustainable civilization that persists for millions of years, or whether we will fail and go extinct like the first civilization did, leaving behind our own messages and warnings for whoever comes after us. That outcome depends on countless choices and actions, most of them small and seemingly insignificant when taken individually, but cumulative in their effects, rippling forward through time in ways we cannot fully predict or control. What we can control is our own engagement, our own sincerity, our own commitment to learning and growing and contributing what we can to the larger pattern. The first civilization showed us what is possible when intelligence and wisdom combined, when technological capability is guided by ethical consideration and long-term thinking, when a civilization maintains connection with its biosphere and with its own deeper nature. They also showed us what happens when civilizations face crises they cannot overcome, when even wisdom and technology prove insufficient to prevent catastrophe and extinction. Both of these lessons are valuable. Both deserve our serious attention and reflection. We can learn from their achievements about what to strive toward, about the kinds of societies and ways of living that create flourishing and meaning and satisfaction for conscious beings. We can learn from their failures and their warnings about what to avoid, about the pitfalls and traps that threaten advanced civilizations, about the importance of maintaining balance and awareness and not allowing short-term thinking to override long-term wisdom. As you drift now into sleep, carrying with you everything we have explored together, let yourself feel the reality that you are connected to something much larger than your individual life, that you carry within yourselves a message from beings who lived and loved and thought and created hundreds of millions of years before you were born, beings who cared enough about the future to try to help you, even though they would never know whether you received their help or what you did with it. You are the answer to their hope, the recipient of their gift, the inheritor of their legacy. What you do with that inheritance is up to you, but know that it connects you to the deep past and potentially to the deep future, that you are part of a chain of consciousness and learning and communication that extends far beyond what your normal awareness can encompass. Know that your existence matters not just to you and your immediate circle, but in a cosmic sense, that you are participating in a pattern of consciousness awakening to itself that may be one of the most important things happening in the universe. Know that the first civilization reached across time to touch you, to offer guidance and support and connection, and that you can reach back in spirit, if not in fact. Can honor what they gave by living well and thinking carefully and contributing what you can to the ongoing story. Sleep now, deeply and peacefully, knowing that you are part of something extraordinary, something that began long before you and will continue long after you, something that gives your life meaning and context and connection to the largest patterns of existence. The genetic transmission lives in you and through you. The message continues its journey forward in time, and you are both its carrier and its reader, both the medium and the recipient, both the inheritor of ancient wisdom and the ancestor of future beings who will look back on our time and wonder what we did with the gift we were given. May you sleep well and dream deep, carried by the knowledge that you are connected to the vast sweep of time, that you matter in ways both intimate and cosmic, that the message from the first civilization has found its way to you and through you continues its eternal journey forward, into whatever futures await. World without end. Consciousness knowing itself. The last transmission echoing forever through the depths of time and the spirals of your own DNA. Rest now and let that message carry you into dreams where past and future merge, where the first civilization walks beside you as friend and guide, where you understand without words that you are exactly where you need to be, doing exactly what you came here to do, living your moment in the eternal return of consciousness, discovering itself anew in each generation, each species, each flickering instant of awareness that arises and passes in the endless dance of existence, becoming aware of its own being. Sleep now. The message is safe within you. The story continues. All is well.